Hello and welcome to the final session in our series of architecture and philosophy sessions. This will be on Gilbert Simondon, and in many ways it'll be a very special session. Simondon is himself not so well known, but we have a very special panel today, which will be chaired by Viktoria Luisa-Barbo. He's someone who's not so well known, so it'd be unusual for that reason. Also, it's a bit unusual because I'm going to be handing over the reins, as it were, to Victoria. And in many ways, I'm very looking forward to this because this is the young and up-and-coming generation of theorists. I would say that theory is in very good hands. I'm delighted to have Andrej Radman here. I know Andrej from Delft for some time. Stavros is due to be, but great to meet you, Stavros. Marisabel has been with us for much of the semester, and it's great to see her there as well. We are seeing the younger generation come through. And then Katie Lloyd-Thomas actually used to be a student of mine many years ago, 20 years ago at the University of Nottingham, and she's now a professor. She won't be here, but we have a recording of her work. This is, of course, the last of the series. As you can see, we've been through we've had quite a series here. All of these sessions are uploaded onto our YouTube link, along with the initial series that we had, which was hosted by Tongji in the summer. So there's some lectures there by Slavoj Žižek and others. If you just go to that site and go and look at the collection we have there. Just to say before we start, this is going to be a very special week for us at Digital Futures. We are hosting our first ever Arabic language session on Tuesday, which I'm looking forward to immensely. This is a huge departure for us and a very significant development. We should not assume that everybody can speak the English language, and it's great to see the first Arabic language session. We also have an a Farsi language session on Friday, which we will be also hosting our first session in Farsi. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to Victoria. Welcome, Victoria, and thank you so much for agreeing to host this intriguing session. I'm going to be turning into a student today because I know a little about Simondon, but I'm really looking forward to this session. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Neil. I will be sharing my screen and get us started. Thank you so much. It's a real honor for me to be hosting today's session. And I'm really excited to introduce or help introduce the work of French thinker Gilbert Simondon to you. Today is the last session within a larger series, as Neil mentioned, that was organized by Neil Leach and Digital Futures, as well as FIU, to connect philosophical ideas with the realm of architecture and design. Yeah, I'm really thankful to be hosting today's session, and I would like to welcome everyone, especially our guests who are joining us from different time zones today, but also all of you watching on Zoom and watching on YouTube Live. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, put them on Zoom in the chat, or put them on YouTube, and we will address them in the panel discussion. So I will give a brief introduction, which will be followed by the presentations, and then we will open it up to panel discussions, which is also part of the audience being able to ask questions. Since a lot of you might be new to the work of Simondon, you should ask questions. Okay, so thank you so much. To engage with the philosophy of Gilbert Simondon, we need to momentarily break out of the artificial separations upon which much of our habitual thinking is based and set our minds and bodies in motion. Simondon encourages us to think in terms of relation and exchange, in terms of resonance and amplification between nature, humans, and technology. His philosophy of individuation is one of process, relationality, and genuine engagement. Ideas of Anaximander's apeiron, Baruch de Spinoza's immanence, and Henri Bergson's indeterminacy are synthesized with 20th century discoveries of thermodynamics and quantum physics in Gilbert Simondon's work. We will enter into a dance, a mingling of intertwining forces, a dance in which the dancers minds are beginning to spin not only around their own axis, but all the other axes, engaging in the generative processes and rich field of potentialities at the root of everything. In a dance, similar to martial arts or surfing, opposing forces do not cancel each other out, but rather create points of access in their encounter, tipping points, if you will, enabling the emergence of novelty. While moving their bodies through space, the dancers are passing from one force field to another, creating new possibilities along their path. Suddenly, the dancers fall out of step with each other, breaking their rhythm. But rather than stopping, they merge with the preceding step, gliding into a new movement pattern. At the intervals between what the dancers intend and what really occurs within the tension between these actions, an impulse of virtuality runs from one actualization to another. Flows of intensities unfold throughout time in the specific now to create a fragile and temporary horizon of choreography within the accelerated and energized space of the dance floor. Simondon's philosophy is inspired by the spontaneous creativity of the nature we encounter in our everyday lives. He draws the line of division not between natural and artificial, but rather between pre-individuated and individuated. In this dynamic system of morphology, the pre-individual, an indeterminate reservoir of potential energy, or apeiron, becomes partially ordered, dephased, and actualized during the process of individuation. Instead of stability and instability, Simondon invokes the concept of metastability, denoting a temporary and fragile moment of stability susceptible to changing conditions. Being for Simondon is not a substance, matter, or shape, but a system in tension, oversaturated, about to spill over at any moment and create novel individuations. In the place of pre-existent or preformed individuated terms, Simondon focuses on the process of information. Like the process of crystallization, where a structural germ, a singularity, breaks the metastable state of a supersaturated mother liquid, which then topographically and temporarily restructures itself into the form of a crystal. There's always a remainder of this unindividuated pre-individual potential. Every individual is always imbued with an unspent and unresolved residue of potential energy that persists within the individual, waiting to be actualized. Individuation is an ongoing process that is never complete, a system that emerges from an energetic realm of potentials, stressing the superfluousness of any transcendental referential system on the outside, and highlighting the rich immanent power of nature. In moving away from discussing what things are, Simondon considers how they come to be and what futures they entail. Ontogenesis rather than ontology. Simondon's ontogenesis conceptualizes living beings as existing within a spectrum where the human-animal difference is one of degree, like temperature, not of kind, like form. Simondon's philosophy accommodates a diverse variety of current and future personhood in his symbiotic way of thinking, extending across physical, biological, social, and even technological milieus. It opens up new spaces and times, revealing not only unpredictable futures, but also unsuspected pasts that had been there all along, but might have gone unnoticed. With seeing reality as an individuation spectrum, Simondon argues for breaking with the tradition of Western thought in order to overcome the divide between nature and techne, nature and artifice, and consequently, nature and culture. As Gilles Deleuze reminds us, a philosophical idea, a philosophical concept is always a thickness, a volume. One can take it at one level, then at another, and still at another one. And that is not contradictory, but the levels are very different from each other. In the same way, the philosophy of Simondon has significantly influenced different thinkers like Gilles Deleuze, Brian Massumi, Muriel Combs, and our guests today, and I hope many more in the future. What designers and architects might take from the encounter with the thickness of Simondon's thought, that is to be discussed today. But let me leave you with one quote by Sanford Quinter on Gilbert Simondon's thought, because I couldn't say it any better myself. What the designer might take from acquaintance with such a system is a fresh and enlightened attitude that design action is always but a modification, a slowing, a selection, and improvisation, introducing a torrent of forces that precedes and extends indifferently beyond it. Every gesture seeding designs and transformations to come. I thought that was a very beautiful way of putting it. And so, yes, thank you. This is kind of the introduction for now, but we have a lot more to hear. And with that, I would like to introduce our guests today. Marisabel Marratt holds a BA and MArch from Princeton University and is currently a doctoral student and lecturer at Georgia Institute of Technology. Marisabel has extensive professional experience in architecture, interior architecture, and scenography in New York, Paris, and Atlanta. Marisabel also holds a graduate certificate in science and technology studies and teaches architectural design, studios, and lectures in the history of modern architecture at Georgia Tech. She is a member of the executive board of the Concave PhD student group and co-academic coordinator for the 2020 International PhD Symposium, Divergence in Architectural Research, as well as co-editor of Divergence in Architecture Research 2021. Marisabel's current research interest lies at the intersection of history and theory, science and technology studies, and design materialization. Stavros Kousoulas is assistant professor of architecture theory in the Faculty of Architecture of TU Delft. He has studied architecture at the National Technical University of Athens and at TU Delft. He received his doctoral title cum laude from IUAV Venice, participating in the Villa de Encore International Research Doctorate. He has published and lectured in Europe and abroad. He has been a member of the editorial board of Footprint, Delft Architecture Theory Journal since 2014. And also from TU Delft, joining us is Andrej Radman, has been teaching design and theory courses at the TU Delft Faculty of Architecture since 2004, a graduate of the Zagreb School of Architecture in Croatia. He's a licensed architect and recipient of the Croatian Architects Association Annual Award for Housing Architecture in 2002. Radman received his master's and doctoral degree from TU Delft and joined the Architecture and Philosophy Theory Group as assistant professor in 2008. He's an editor of the peer-reviewed Journal for Architecture Theory Footprint. His research focuses on new materialist ecologies and radical empiricism. Radman's latest publication is Ecologies of Architecture, Essays on Territorialization in 2021. And last but not least, Katie Lloyd-Thomas. She's a professor of theory and history of architecture and co-director of the Architecture Research Collaborative at Newcastle University. Unfortunately, she cannot join us in person today, but Neil was so kind to record an interview with her, which we will play now before entering into the upcoming presentations of our guests. So this is her book, Building Materials, and she will be giving an interview about her new book.
So today I'm delighted to have Katie Lloyd-Thomas.
Oh. Sorry about that.
With me, Katie Lloyd is a
We cannot hear the sound, Victoria.
I've lost sound. I can play it from my end if you want, Victoria. I think it's your sound that's gone. Do you want me to play it from my end? We can't hear.
Is it now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. I can try it again. Sorry, I'll play it again. I'm very sorry about that.
That addresses the question of Simondon. Katie, it's great to see you. Let me put up onto the screen the book itself so we can see what we're talking about. So what is so unusual about this book is it engages with Simondon in the context of architectural specifications. Perhaps I could ask you, first of all, just to explain to those not familiar with the term, what are architectural specifications?
Okay, it's a good question. So maybe the easiest way to think about the architectural specification is there are usually two documents, sets of documents that come to describe a building before it's built. One are the drawings, which describe the kind of the form and the extent of the building using geometry. And then there's also a written document, which gives the materials and sometimes the quality of workmanship. And in fact, that written document, the specification, vastly predates the drawing and has been much more prevalent because, of course, listing the building materials that you're going to use and pricing them is very important before you start any building work. So they've changed a lot over the centuries. They're different between different building cultures and across time as well. But yes, it's a very loose definition, but basically that written set of details for the materials of building.
Okay, great. I should say that building materials is going to be published on the 16th of December by Bloomsbury in London. So the interesting thing and the intriguing thing about this book is that the title refers to specifications as though it's going to be addressing one of the more mundane, well, to some people anyway, more mundane aspects of the architectural office, and yet it is ultimately a book about theory. Why bring in a philosopher to address specifications?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's very mute. The cover is very mute, and the title doesn't give anything away that this is very much a book about Gilbert Simondon. But indeed, you're right, it is. And I think in a way, I'm not sure that it is a book about specifications, although it does use the specifications. And maybe the most useful way to think about it is that my interest really was in a different kind of question. And the question really was, how do we think about building materials outside a concept of matter? Matter doesn't seem to be a very useful concept with which to think building materials, or perhaps materials in all sorts of other practices as they're kind of used and mobilized. So that's really the starting point for the book. And in fact, it emerged quite early on when I was looking at feminist theory and psychoanalysis and started thinking about building materials more generally, and indeed particularly like in relation to the work of Jennifer Bloomer and Catherine Ingraham all those years ago when I was doing the Masters at Nottingham with you, Neil. And I started engaging, first of all, with the specification because it, quite late on in responding to the question, because it affords a set of descriptions of materials, and those descriptions, I argue, aren't conceptually the same. So sometimes materials are just named, sometimes they're described in terms of the processes through which they come into being, and in more contemporary times, they're described through performance. So it's all about what they do rather than what they are or how they're made. And I suppose so I got to this kind of point with thinking about these as literally as different concepts for building materials. And I think it was through John Patavi's book, Political Physics. I read something about Simondon, and this is quite some time ago. This is sort of mid-2000s, maybe 2005, something like that. And what interested me first about Simondon was just a critique of polymorphism. So I could start to think about this sort of problem of matter and the form matter binary in architecture. But when I started reading the first chapter of the book on individuation, which was translated, of course, that's the chapter where Simondon describes the moulding of the wet clay brick. And what was really striking was how similar it was to a set of specifications for casting concrete that I was reading. They were from the 1930s, so some modernist houses in the UK. And I suppose that's what started me off engaging with Simondon. But finally, the engagement went much further than that. So as I started to read more and more, and I think in the first place, what Simondon gives us is an account of, or the possibility of thinking ontogenetically, so thinking about becoming of entities coming into being. So that was useful to start to move away from thinking about materials as substance and start to think about their coming into being. So I think the book is a kind of ontogenetic inquiry. Second, he sort of provides an account of the technical object, and the book argues really that we think of materials as technical objects. And third, and this is perhaps a more kind of complicated bit of the argument, he focuses on the mediations which are made possible through individuation. So individuation is also a mediation of coming into relation. And that was extremely important for the way that I built the theory of building materials, arguing, for example, that there might be a relationship between the wet concrete and the formwork that's made possible through a set of preparations. But similarly, another set of preparations might make it possible for a piece of performance engineered glass to have a relationship with a particular security threat in a country. So there's sort of the engagement with Simondon just kind of complexified. And maybe the final thing to say as well is I think that Simondon gives us a kind of proposal for something called transductive thought. And transductive thought is an idea that problems come into being through the process of the thought and the thing that we think them with. And in that way, I suppose I don't think of what I've done with Simondon's philosophy as applying Simondon's philosophy to the specification, but rather that through thinking the specification and Simondon's work together, a set of questions or possibilities kind of come into being, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
No, I think it's clear that Simondon is capturing the imagination of a number of architectural theorists right now, which is moving. But I guess the question I would have is why has he been overlooked for so long?
Well, I think it probably took me an extra year doing my PhD because I had to read Simondon in French. So at that time, there was a couple of translations around on the internet. Taylor Adkins' book's only just come out. So of course, it's made it much easier now that it's in English. I mean, there was when I started, there was some interest because of Deleuze and Guattari using his idea of the pre-individual. So that was already, and in France, there was already some commentaries. And the two commentaries in English, which were really fantastic, were one by Adrian Mackenzie for Transductions, Bodies at Speed, and also Alberto Toscano's Theatres of Production. So there were these couple of books that were there. And I think, yeah, people like Lars Foybrecht were already looking at Simondon and interested in him, particularly to think about kind of emergent behaviours, but not, I think, in the way that I was engaging with him. So I think there's some, yeah, so I suppose those are the reasons in a way why the interest had been slow to pick up. And I'm sure that that he's now, of course, not just that it's translated, but also, I mean, this, you know, enormous sort of body of work around living systems. I think he's been kind of very important for that, for cybernetics, for questions around iterative forms of making, so particularly around digital making. Some of the most interesting stuff, the things that I find the most interesting are sort of where Simondon's been picked up for thinking about kind of inventive or iterative ways of making, where maybe the relationship between the maker and the designer has been altered. It's a fantastic PhD that I read by Helena Westerlind, for example, at KTH about digital printing with concrete, for example. But I suppose, so there are lots of interesting ways that it's being read at the moment, that Simondon's being used. But I think for me, the most important reason that architects need to read him is his argument about technology and technical activity as being central to culture. So that in general, it's disregarded in the way I think architects tend to relegate the technical to the sort of, you know, the underside of architecture. It's outside sort of architecture, proper architecture discourse. And it seems to me that there are sort of two reasons that's really important that we attend to the technical. And the first is that's actually where huge changes are happening. And if you believe, as I do, that concepts get formed, through production and technical practices, we need to be looking at those and not have them kind of, bite us on the back or not even see them. And I think, and the other reason is, I think, because of this account which he gives of the possibilities for different ways of working with technology, so that there might be inventive or iterative ways of working rather than kind of alienated forms of working. And for me, that's again why it's so important that architects start to engage with
Great. I mean, I think this book is probably going to be something of a catalyst in terms of kind of opening up the world with the thinking of Simondon. And it seems to me that there is definitely a kind of a gathering of a number of different minds all looking for the same French philosopher. So hopefully we're going to see a whole new chapter of thinking about materials in a radically different way based on this kind of work. So we look forward to seeing the launch of this book. It's coming out, just to repeat, it's coming out with Bloomsbury and published in London, who published Harry Potter. And also, I would say, my own book on AI is coming out also on the 16th of December.
On the same day.
Exactly the same day. Great. Well, it's wonderful to see you again, Katie. Katie, I should say, was a student of mine a long time ago at the University of Nottingham Masters, and now she's become a very eminent professor in her own right. So thank you, Katie. We look forward to reading the book.
Great. Thanks very much, Neil.
Okay, thank you. I, again, apologize. In this type of performance, we don't have a wardrobe malfunction, but a technology malfunction. So I apologize for that. But with that very interesting interview, I would want to hand it over to our guests. And I will turn off my camera, but we'll see each other after. And I hope everyone has already gathered some questions, and we'll ask some questions during the panel discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. So I guess I'm the next Well, let me start. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the Digital Futures Doctoral Consortium on what can architects learn from philosophy. I very much welcome your initiative, which strongly resonates with our own efforts of exposing TU Delft architecture students to philosophy, but also, as my colleague Stavros will insist, to reclaim the importance of architecture for philosophers. It is symptomatic that architecture has often been described as the first art, not a mere epiphenomenon of culture, but the collective equipment of terraforming, in Benjamin Bratton's terms, here on Earth. The ritornello of our architecture, philosophy, and theory group goes like this. We cannot decide to think differently. To think differently, we'll have to feel differently. From this point of view, the purpose of design is to rewire our brains. And architecture framed in such a way is effectively a psychotropic practice. In the words of Daniel Smile from his book, Deep History and the Brain, I quote, "The mood-altering practices, behaviors, and institutions generated by human culture are psychotropic mechanisms. These mechanisms have neurochemical effects that are not all that dissimilar from those produced by drugs," unquote. My presentation will consist of three parts. First, my credentials, as it were. Second, Simondonian concepts pertinent for the architecture in the expanded field. And third, meta-modeling based on Guattari's schizoanalytic cartographies. So here we go, part one. Stavros and I have been running an advanced architecture theory PhD course since 2014 under the banner of the Ecologies of Architecture. You can see the variety of the issues we tackled here on the slide. We devoted one particular season to the close reading of Simondon's on the mode of existence of technical objects. This semester, we have also run a pilot of our very first transdisciplinary official course on habits and habitats in cooperation with our colleague Sjoerd van Taunen from Rotterdam Erasmus School of Philosophy. We named it Modes of Existence, Architecture and Philosophy. The acronym is MAP. MAP, of course, is evocative of the concept of the diagram, which popped up in your session on Foucault in relation to Deleuze, and again in Hélène Frichot's intervention. The course consists of three modules: key concepts, technicities, and diagrammatics. Very briefly, its ambition is to reclaim the importance of architectural technicity as the sine qua non of trans-individuation. More on this later. By the way, Stavros and I propose to write it with capital T and capital C. Technicity is shorthand for what Bernard Stiegler calls epiphylogenesis, or evolution by means other than life, a kind of exosomatization or exorganology, which is a near synonym of Simondon's mechanology. In other words, the built environment becomes an exteriorized artificial organ, hence exo-organ, and the line "we build our cities and in return they build us" takes a literal meaning. And I'm paraphrasing here Victoria from the session on ecology with Quinter. Finally, both Stavros and I have recently co-edited issues of Footprint, Delft Journal of Architecture Theory, devoted to Simondon, number 28, and his legacy as taken up by Stiegler, number 30. You can find the first issue online at the address below, and the second one is due in spring 2022. The reference to our courses and open source publications was not meant as a shameless public product placement, or not only. So we go to part two. It is meant to demonstrate our commitment to the very task that your doctoral consortium set for itself, namely to reposition architecture as a material/discursive practice. Most importantly, to help it step out of the parochial tradition or bad habit of privileging structure over operation. And it is here that Simondon becomes indispensable. As we will see, operation and structure are actually co-constitutive. I cannot stress enough how disorienting the theory of operations is for those unaccustomed to the Simondonian non-hylomorphic, transductive metastability, which is a mouthful. Each of these concepts deserves full attention, but in the interest of time, I will focus mainly on alagmatics. There is no point in denying that my take on Simondon is heavily inflected by the work of Deleuze and Guattari. and more recently by their compatriot Bernard Stiegler, who passed away last year. So, preliminaries aside, what is alagmatics? This, of course, is already a badly posed question. We should rather ask in the Spinozian tenor, what does it do? The straightforward answer is that it modifies and transforms structures. The operation is that which makes structures appear. In the second part of Simondon's doctoral thesis from 1964, Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, the term pops up several times. And there's also a whole chapter with the eponymous heading under supplements. Let us look at some of the original formulations. And I quote, "The name alagmatic could be given to such a genetic method that seeks to grasp individuated beings as the development of a singularity that unifies the overall energetic and material conditions. In fact, we should note that this method does not involve a pure causal determinism, also known as mechanicism. In fact, the being extends in time the meeting of the two groups of conditions that it expresses. It is not just the result, but also the agent, both of the milieu of this meeting and the extension of this realized compatibility." End quote. In the Deleuzian parlance, it is both the actual cause and the virtual quasi-cause. According to the Stoicist logos spermatikos, a state of affairs always produces an incorporeal effect, which in turn operates as a quasi-cause. Simondon again on the logic of transduction, which is crucial for alagmatic epistemology. I will not read this quote. I just want to point out that Simondon underscores the historical condition that yields the very conceptual terms for studying individuation, namely the discovery of field theories, as Viktoria already mentioned, thermodynamics and quantum physics. In a nutshell, why deduction remains tautological, because it doesn't produce anything new, and induction all too extrapolating, transduction is not reflective or representational, but diffractive in Karen Barratt terms. Transduction is not a matter of communication, for how could it be, given that it's about progressive differentiation or falling out of phase even with itself? It is about non-entailment and impredicativity. In other words, what is defined participates in its own definition. Finally, a word on metastability, that is to say neither stable nor unstable condition. The interior past and exterior future confront each other at the level of polarized milieu. This confrontation in the operation of selective assimilation is the present of the living being, which is formed by this polarity of passage and obstruction between past substances and substances to come, that are present to one another via the operation of individuation. The present of this metastability of the bond between the interior and exterior, past and future, the exterior is exterior, interior, relative to this mutual alagmatic activity of presence. I believe this is what Manning and Masumi call immediation. So not mediation, but immediation. Topology and chronology coincide in the individuation of the living being. So that is to say, space and time here are not a priori. It is only later on, and according to psychical and collective individuation, that the coincidence can be broken. Topology and chronology are not a priori forms of sensibility, Kantianism, but the very dimensionality of the living being undergoing individuation, unquote. I will not go into details because I rely on Stavros, who has developed this thoroughly in his forthcoming book for Routledge. I just want to note that to my mind, this is affordance theory avant la lettre. Insofar as it deals with the transformative dynamisms that cannot be designated by an objective domain, alagmatics belongs to what Eric Hall calls a generalized ecology. But how does an ecology decide? This is the question that Rodrigo Nunes addresses in his recent book. According to him, an ecology is less than an organism and more than an organization. Less than an organism means that the emergence and functioning of its components is not determined in advance by some unifying principle. And more than an organization means that an ecology is not intentional and does not have agreed upon boundaries. Nunes's venturing below and beyond the bounds of the individual conforms to Simondon's pre-individual and trans-individual milieus, or what Deleuze and Guattari designated as epistrata and parastrata. This brings us to the third and the final part, where I will provide a cartography of such ecological exchanges and modification of states, what Frischot referred to as the Stengerian art of relaying. It is, of course, just as difficult to define an operation as it is to define structure other than by example. The best example I could come up with is not by Simondon, but by Félix Guattari from his Schizoanalytic Cartographies 1989. I'm referring to his diagram of the fourfold, here Genosko's rendering, which is not a structuralist synoptic model, but a machinic synaptic meta model, which surveys the singularities at play. Guattari's four functors, or four unconsciousnesses, as he called them, are existential territories and incorporeal universes of value on the virtual right half of the diagram, and energetic plus semiotic flows and abstract machinic phyla on the actual left side of the left-hand side. The fourth fold will help us grasp a dynamic unity without identity of an open system simultaneously as operation and structure, with the caveat that the whole here is not off the parts, but alongside them. The fourfold is axiological in Simondon terms, as it takes on both a normative and a metaphysical sense. This is to say that it grasps the reciprocity of axiological dynamisms and ontological structures. In his 1966 review, Deleuze describes Simondon's work as a profoundly original theory of individuation. Physical, vital, and psychosocial individuation. Traditionally, and Viktoria already has done great work here, traditionally the principle of individuation relates to an already made, fully constituted individual. But for Simondon, individuation comes first, and it is placed everywhere. The preliminary condition of individuation is the existence of a metastable system. The state of pre-individual being is thus singular without being individual, and individuation is the organization of a solution, or better, a resolution of an objectively problematic system, marked by disparation of at least two orders of magnitude. So what is then the difference between the physical and the vital individuation? The physical individuation is content to receive information once. The prime example is the crystal, which reiterates an initial singularity, and it grows by the surface and makes no use of interiority. By contrast, the living being successively receives many supplies of information and adds up many singularities. Increasingly complex levels of individuation bring us closer to our concern, namely architecture's role in trans-individuation, technicity. A properly psychical individuation arises precisely when the vital functions are not sufficient to resolve the problems posed to the living. Perhaps this marks the birth of immunology, a moment of anticipation, of protension, when a new charge of pre-individual reality is mobilized within a new problematic, calling for a new process of resolution. As William James put it in his essays on radical empiricism, if experience was perfectly harmless or smooth, there would be no need to isolate its terms, no need for concepts. Trans-individuation is in fact triggered by what Simondon's mentor, Georges Canguilhem, calls the inconsistency of the environment in his Normal and the Pathological from 1966. By the way, his other mentor was Merleau-Ponty. This infidelity of the environment, as Stiegler calls it, keeps the Darwinian perfect fit at bay. More importantly, it circumvents the short-circuiting and resists the overfitting that comes with the ethos of optimization, the total coincidence of the map with the territory, the wet dream of parametricists. To quote Antoinette Roura, who draws on Derrida's critique of metaphysics of presence, we have to stop reducing the future to the optimization of the present. I will repeat this. We have to stop reducing the future to the optimization of the present. According to Guattari, black holes as catatonic states appear precisely when an organism completely coincides with its environment, preventing the psychic to open upon a transversal collective. As already implied, the problem can be recast in terms of the degree of mnemonic detachability. It is beyond dispute that the built environment, as differential exo-organization par excellence, that is to say, as tertiary retention, bears the capacity to catalyze noesis, the process of thought. Think of the Kubrick bone/ship, 4 million years drift. We must debunk the genesis of thinking in thought itself. Simondon insists that being can only be grasped in reciprocity with becoming, through which the ontogenetic process transduces or propels itself. This is his formula. The knowledge of individuation is the individuation of knowledge. In the session on Frederick Jameson, Michael Speaks referred to the Spinozian third kind of knowledge. Neither of the effect nor of the cause, common notion, but the intuitive quasi-causal mode of knowledge, which will be our segue to the fourfold. Guattari's horizontal axis of reference maps on Simondon's ontological real difference from his neologism of the axis ontological, whereas the vertical axis of consistency maps on Simondon's normative modal difference. God is a lobster. This double articulation that relates forms and substances of both contents and expressions challenges our ingrained notion of causality, hence my advocacy of quasi-causality. Consider the case of the irreducible multiplicity known as metropolis, based on Kohlhaas's delirious New York, the retroactive manifesto from 1978, or how Otis's contingent invention of the mechanical vertical flow, also known as elevator, F, triggered the speciation of the skyscraper, phi, that nourished the culture of congestion, U, which in turn affected the process of subjectification, T, at the bottom right. The contingently obligatory bachelor machine, whereby the subject is produced as a remainder, an appendage to the big machine to which he is connected. Deleuze and Guattari characterized this existential apprehension as a machine of consumption under the third synthesis of time, a gratification that could be seen as autoerotic, erotic or autoaffective. What we are looking here now are the snippets from the synopsis of the NY from 1977, so a year before. F, the elevator is the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. The further it travels upward, the more undesirable the circumstances it leaves behind. Any given site could now be multiplied ad infinitum. P, or phi, the skyscraper is one of the rare 20th century buildings that is truly revolutionary or evolutionary by means other than life. It offers a full inventory of technical and psychological modification quasi-caused by the metropolitan life, and these psychoactive technicities engender a spectrum of experiences that was previously actually unthinkable. You could not think it, because remember, something forces us to think. It's not a matter of volition. U, metropolitan condition, engenders an architecture with its own laws, methods, and achievements that has remained largely outside of the field of official architecture and criticism, even to this day, I would add. Finally, T, the metropolitan subject, emerging from the elevator on the 9th floor, finds himself in a vestibule that leads directly to a locker room. Here he undresses and puts on gloves and enters an adjoining space equipped for boxing and wrestling. But on the southern side, the locker room is also served by a small oyster bar. Eating oysters with boxing gloves on the nth floor, that's the 20th century in action, concludes Kohlhaas. If I had the time, and I don't, I would play a short clip from the video dating back to 14 March 1976. So even the year before. So the previous snippets from 1977. This is 1976, where young Kohlhaas pitches the idea at the Architectural Association London, and the reaction of the audience is priceless. You can check it out at this link. At any rate, what Guattari's fourfold expounds is in fact anticipated in the following quote by Simondon from his On the Mode of Existing of Technical Objects, 1958. I quote, "Adaptation concretization is a process that conditions the birth of a milieu rather than being conditioned by an already given milieu. It is conditioned by a milieu that only exists virtually before invention. There is invention because there is a leap that takes place and is justified by means of relation that brings about within the milieu that it creates." It's very convoluted, but it's meant to be so. "The condition of possibility of this turbo-generated couple is in its realization," unquote. The plastic principle from the Deleuze book of Nietzsche stipulates that the condition is never bigger, greater than the conditioned. And we know that Simondon was a great reader of Nietzsche. In his Technics and Time 4, posthumously published only recently, Stiegler concludes that what is at stake here is conditioning of the present by the future, by that which is not yet. What is at stake is a horizon of finalities, occupying the upper part of our diagram, where this singularization actually occurs, both forming and formed by what is called protensions after Husserl. According to Stiegler, such a horizon is possible only because the present and the future are presented and projected on the basis of tertiary retentions, which constitute these pretensions precisely as an associated milieu that is both trans and pre-individual, so both the left and the right side of the diagram. In the words of Simondon, the technical object, insofar as it has been invented, thought, and willed, and taken up by human subject, becomes the medium and symbol of this relationship, which we would like to name the trans-individual. According to Stiegler, this is a question of analyzing the transductive co-individuation through the exosomatic cogenesis of functions that gets meta-stabilized and materialized. This means that the architectural enunciation, to use Guattari's term from schizoanalytic cartographies, is always already collective or constituted by the technical trans-individual that precedes it. And that it is impossible to isolate the post-human subject from these preceding exosomatic productions that are carriers of information defined as difference that makes a difference. Simondon indeed sensed before many of his contemporaries that something was missing from the quantitative, that is to say, cryptostructuralist approaches to information. Trans-individual remains outside of any inter-individual relation. Given the framework of this event, Doctoral Consortium, I would like to conclude on a pedagogical note by ventriloquizing Stiegler. It is the ability to constantly enrich and renew knowledge that finds itself exhausted and sterilized today. Privileging the efficiency of applied over speculative research, according to its purely and simply computational criteria, discredits academia and makes it utterly incapable of re-articulating the four quasi-causes, incapable of reevaluating values, and finally, incapable of escaping the lingering structuralism in digital disguise that remains trapped in the shackles of efficient causality. We, the educators, can do better. Thank you so much for your attention. We now go to Marisabel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. And now we're actually going to hand over to Marisabel, who will be presenting.
Thank you, Andrej. Thank you, Victoria. Let me share my screen. Do you see it?
Yes, we see it. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Again, thank you, Andrej and Victoria. Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity, as well as the possibility of being part of this presentation today. I would like to say one thing, and that is that sort of as a kind of a quick comment to some of what Katie Lloyd-Thomas was referring to, Simondon is still very difficult to really come to understand because of the lack of translations of his works. And that has actually become something that I'm extremely I've been fortunate to be able to access everything in French, but I think that that is actually one of those things that has actually impacted how we come to know Simondon. Really, we come to know through these sort of small bits and pieces that we see online, etc. Whereas he has an extensive body of work, and so this is sort of one of those things that I just wanted to mention. It's still a case now that we have this as an issue. So now, hopefully, with more interest, we'll have more. We'll see more of the actual original works of Simondon published. So what I would like to do right now is actually, in the remarks that follow, I would like to expand on the nature of the transductive operation as technicity and as an understanding of, excuse me, I'm having, which Simondon develops in his parallel investigations on the nature and essence of technical objects, where he explores the particular technicities of living and inanimate systems and reveals the technical experience with its embedded potential for aesthetic unity. And so the investigations that Simondon pursues involve confronting a psychosocial, material, and aesthetic reality. In particular, the perceived rupture between the culture and techniques. In both his primary thesis and secondary thesis, he lays the ground. And so here you see noted his primary thesis being L'individuation à la lumière des notions de forme et d'information, which currently remains untranslated in its entirety. And then, of course, on the mode of existence of technical objects, which fortunately has been translated. These were the primary and secondary theses that he presented in 1958. So these investigations, sort of the investigations he pursues, confronts a psychosocial, material, and aesthetic reality. And so in both of these theses, he lays the ground for an increasing harmonization between cultural prerogatives and technical functionalities, a phenomenon that encompasses the technical object and yet is more than object. It is ontological and evolutionary, or and so in this, and I quote, "The presence of man-machine is a perpetual invention. What resides in machines is a human reality. Human gestures are fixed and crystallized in structures that function," unquote. Simondon's project suggests that both human and machine become and are made. They are co-modulated. And then the question becomes whether they should share common destinies. Simondon's formulation of beings in transduction weaves a dense fabric that encompasses metaphysical, empirical, and psychosocial phenomena. The introduction of the operation of transduction is discussed as a biological, physical, mental, and social operation that propagates within a specific domain. It's a concept that's introduced early on in the introduction of his primary thesis, and according to conditions of existence. It is a successive operation, as has been mentioned, and these successive phasings are the motor for the emergence of a reticulated structure. Now, transduction simultaneously refers to individuation and the process of thinking this individuation itself. The reticulation of relations that is milieu emerge simultaneous to this becoming. The operation of transduction is Simondon's hack of the classical principles of identity and the excluded middle, and a reframing of the hylomorphic schema in the theory of knowledge, which form-matter duality has served as a ground for the subsequent dualistic splits, subject-object, and the Cartesian ego-cogito of mind-body that have played, for Simondon, a true understanding of the conditions of existence. With his project, Simondon aims to found a new logic of formation, an axiomatics that reframes or reforms the fundamental philosophical underpinnings discussed, so as to privilege a knowledge of beings not as they have become a posteriori, but in their multiple potentials of becoming. The crux is that this logic must develop in the course of the operation, not before, not after. And no known logical system is formulated in this way. A strict axiomatics, mathematical and scientific, is thus not possible, but a set of principles or first propositions linking the fundamental concepts is. In this sense, Simondon challenges is to find a common axiomatic that enables the unification of the human sciences, such as sociology and psychology, with the life sciences and physical sciences. Simondon and milieu. In the context of his initial publications in 1958, Simondon explores operations and systems of relations as ontological and as first principles, ontogenetic, and first principles. These privilege information over form. His objective is to establish a genetic encyclopedia, one that would think the genesis of each thing in its functionings. It is by means of this encyclopedia that Simondon would address the contemporary social malaise described at the time as a technophobia, a rampant technophobia, by invoking a new conception of humanism and offering a means of human liberation. He also aims to rehabilitate technics and the technical object as a subject worthy of speculative consideration. It is by way of this new idea of encyclopedism that Simondon seeks to address the social malaise, again, the technophobia, by invoking a new conception of humanism and also to rehabilitate technics and the technical object as worthy of speculative consideration. Excuse me, I think I just read two things twice. This is less an exceptionalist understanding of the human and more a complex and rich envisioning of what reality and our framing of it should encompass. For this, Simondon will draw from multiple sources, as has been mentioned, from a reframing of the philosophy of nature and the pre-Socratics, Anaximander's Apeiron, the nature of physis, his study of Bergson and its center of indeterminacy, the élan vital, Goldstein's organicity, Merleau-Ponty and his formulation of body, mind, space, Georges Canguilhem, a great mentor of his, and the theorization of the life sciences and the epistemology of science, and the discoveries and theories of, it must be mentioned, paleoanthropologist André Leroi-Gourhan and ethnosociologist Marcel Mauss and historians of religion Michel Eliade, not to mention also art historians Henri Faucillon and Élie Faure. Lastly, that spectrum of influences must encompass the important role that concepts in quantum mechanics and thermodynamics play in the development of his conception of metastable equilibrium and of phase modes of existence, as well as the key role that cybernetics Norbert Wiener and the theory of information's Claude Shannon play in Simondon's developing intuitions on the conception of form as information, as the nature of autonoma and technical objects, and the transduction of living beings. Simondon understands that information, unlike form, is not a singular form, but is a singular term, but is a signification that arises from a disparation. The idea of the disparate, a French term, which means a break in the logical structure of a relation, is critical to Simondon, for whom this gap or break invites a restructuring or analogical leap of invention. In this idea of genetic encyclopedism, two essential paradigms serve as examples of the augmented and reticulated complexities of the technical operation. The first resides in the structuring of the crystal from the seed in the salt bath, where each anterior phase structures the next. The second resides in the image of the clay being worked in the mold, modulated, which begins with the extraction of clay as the articulate matter and then proceeds through the working and preparation of the material, modulated through the potential energies inherent in the material itself and the energetic field of action of the artisan brick maker, and then the dynamic between the supposedly inert clay and the supposedly abstract mold. Again, referring to one of Katie Lloyd-Thomas's also comments. Now, the technical object and technicity. This event, October 4th, 1957, marks a seminal event in the eyes of the world. An earthly artifact, baptized satellite, is flung into orbit and transformed into a celestial being. For Simondon, the launching of Sputnik 1, I quote, provided evidence that technology as a veritable dimension of the human world could no longer be erroneously reduced to the category of instrumentality, unquote. For several weeks, this object encircles the globe, a testament not only to man's ingenuity, but also convincing proof that mankind has now wrested free of its earthly bounds, its material bounds. It could harness nature, physis, and ride it, God only knew where. Now, this event follows a decade during which Simondon systematically researches and constructs a historical survey of notions of individuation from antiquity to his present day. So the theory is carefully constructed from this analysis. He is also intent on investigating technical objects, deconstructing them, interrogating how they emerge, and troubling their modes of existence, both internal, the biophysical, as a cryptotechnics, and external, the psychosocial, as a phanerotechnics. With these objects, the issue that Simondon confronts is not only technical. He takes interest in society's dichotomy between the timeless object of culture and the ephemerality of the technical object, always on the brink of obsolescence. This distinction leads to a complex game of hide and seek. What is technological is masked in order to highlight what is constant and thereby of culture. In other words, what is considered real and lasting is what is recognized as stabilized form. Yet the alternation between object and stabilized form, in this case, the image of the object, informs in a manner that lends not just to technical objects, to a technical knowledge of the object and stabilized form, but also to an experience of what is more than object as another form of knowledge of the object, a techno-aesthetics. Simondon coins the term cryptotechnics and phanerotechnics, thus constructing a mechanism for understanding the technical object according to the manner in which it reveals itself to the world. The almost prosaic application of cryptotechnics and phanerotechnics in light of the rich potentiality of these terms belies the superficiality of the circumstances that engender this effect, the producer-consumer cycle, and the alienation of the work that this implies. Once removed from the immediacy of production, the technological object, bereft of a consumer, is subject to the fate of being sold as spare parts. Beyond the nihilistic character of this cycle of consumption, Simondon is also alert to its possibilities, however, particularly the aesthetic potential, not to say power, of the cryptophanero as ritual, which is not dissimilar from the alternation of the sacred and profane in a less secular context. Alongside the objects, Simondon elaborates his conception of technicity, not as a product of the social sciences, but as the simultaneous manifestation of an operation and as its principle. Technicity appears as a, I quote, technicity appears as a structure that resolves an incompatibility, unquote. And yet this structure is not intended as a stable and fixed set of relations, the minimum that suffices to bring the system to rest. The structuration, in fact, is one of dynamic relation, and so this emergent structure is entirely provisional. However, as befits an axiomatic that must deploy from its own conditions of existence a logic proper to it, not all individuations are equal, and not all transductions are the same. Simondon will distinguish the individuation of the living from the individuation of the technical object. While the living being individuates and may momentarily individualize in its phased succession, the technical object follows a different pathway. It concretizes. This concretization follows a trajectory from the abstract, i.e. the indeterminate and the generic, to the more concrete, in other words, specific and unique to its circumstance. The technical object has capacity to remain plurifunctional and open to its environment to a high degree, yet undergoes increasing degrees of specificity in function and operation in course of its phase transductions. Eventually, the object attains a stability which in this case manifests in the internal resonance of the relationship, of the relation between its parts. Then it becomes highly differentiated and capable of further transformation. The technical object does not individualize even momentarily. Thus, identity for the technical object lies not in a stable form, but it is in its essential lines, what Simondon will call the ligne essentielle, traced in the unfolding of the phases of life of the technical object. A much loved example of Simondon's has already been shown by Andrej, which is the gimbal thermocouple. Now, technicity is described as transitory, as partial reality that is both result and principle. And yet, this structuration that resolves an incompatibility does not solely exist internal to the technical object and its milieu. Simondon opens with these questions. What is technicity? Where does it originate? And what does it produce? It starts, according to Simondon, with a break, a gap. The unity of the magical universe, and this is Simondon drawing from the work of Mauss and Eliade, which is rich in potentials, is split in two. On this one side, of religiosity is the ground, and on the other, technics, a specialization of figural functions. And so he will go on to say, I quote, the mediation between man and the world is objectivized as technical object, just as it is subjectivized as religious mediator, unquote. Both religion and technics have capacity for evolutionary divergence, but this divergence must find its dynamic equilibrium by a counterforce of convergence, a relational function that maintains a unity. Simondon expands on this technicity as a quasi-primordial force, a key to understanding our reality, and as key as the forces of gravity or magnetic attraction. Evolutionary divergence and then convergence. For Simondon, it is the possibility of this convergence that saves the magical principle and keeps it alive. In this section, the chaîne opératoire, analogy, and communication across orders of magnitude, these are the phases or modes of existence of human culture. This unchaining progression of phasing is key to establishing the dynamic relations of equilibrium and tension. It is the system of phasing that constitutes the reality and not each phase in itself, which only differentiates itself in its relations established within the system. The concept of the operative chain, chaîne opératoire, the phase progressions that structure themselves from the preceding phase are offered in a direct contrast to the dialectical model that incorporates negation as the route to progress. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, a refutation of the status quo is not really what Simondon is aiming for. In this sense, the transductive operation here referred to as technicity does not correspond to a sense of finality or of a teleology. This is a different idea of human and technological progress and a different dynamic, not teleology, not the idea of progress, or of mechanistic progressions in time and space, matter and memory, an evolution that transforms the very environment and conditions of existence it seeks to emerge with. In the context of this reticulated structure, analogy, or the identity of relations, becomes the sole means of acquisition of knowledge of conditions of existence. This is not an analogical logic of similitude or resemblance, but an analogy of relation as a sole means of knowing the real. It is the individual who will bring diverse orders of magnitude or scales into communication. Where there is no communication, there is no possibility of individualizing. We simply remain in a state of indeterminacy. This reflection precedes the levels of granularity and instantaneity, of course, afforded by today's contemporary technologies, and yet it's indicative of a reformulation of that quantum conception of the universe, the thermodynamic conception of the universe is progressing towards a more entropic state. Rather, Simondon reverses this, and in this reticulate and provisional structuring and restructuring, the negentropic progression to greater and greater degrees of articulation further serves to underline the idea of a genetic encyclopedism. Technical object, technical experience, and aesthetic experience. It may be said that in the search of this magical unity, the technicity as a transduction effectuates three things: a unity of being, a unity of the object of knowledge, and a unity of operation. As a technical operation, one is still, however, left wondering, what of technicity's properties? This seems elusive in what Simondon has to say. What is the nature of the trajectory of this unfolding? Does it have a pattern? Is it cyclical, rhythmic, or recursive? That it also involves a certain conception of aesthetic experience is intimated in various examples of his writing, from the early to the latter parts of his career. The clue may well reside in the references to modes of existence, where object and subject and forms of knowledge conflate and concatenate. As modes of existence, technicity then absorbs the perception of duration and of measured time, of material existence and psychosocial structuring. All these are necessitated by and as a result of this operation, which is also experience. The clues point to a specific type of knowledge through techniques, which also informs the destiny of the human and the technological. I quote, "Destiny in this is this coincidence of the line of life and of the reality of the world via a network of gestures with exceptional value. Every mediating gesture is aesthetic, even and perhaps essentially outside the work of art." The obscuring and revealing, the encrypting and decrypting of the techniques in the knowledge and experience of technicity is the operational vector guiding Simondon's research through philosophy, experimental psychology, and theories of perception, of information, cybernetics, and the rigorous analysis of art and industrial objects. While many examples serve to reveal the complex intensity of his engagement with techno-reality, perhaps none are as evocative as the experience rendered in a letter written in 1982, addressed to Jacques Derrida, which the intended recipient never received. The circumstances of the communication are unknown. The letter was found in Simondon's personal papers following his passing in 1989. I quote, "Certain aesthetic objects call for a technical analysis. The Mona Lisa has provoked passionate responses. This may be due to the fact that this painting is essentially plural. It exists like a superimposition of itself, a bit like a full summary in the so-called exact sciences. On the very same canvas, one encounters the beginning and the end of a smile, but not the exhaustion of the smile, the entelechy of the smile. It's only the two extreme terms of the smile that are painted and revealed. The smile's complete unfolding is read into the painting by those who contemplate it. They constitute this unfolding in their own individual or personal interiority. The smile that begins and the smile that ends so as to return to the face's mask of seriousness are the extreme terms of this temporal thickness. The smile will unfold itself, and at the same time, it will also appear, also already be disappearing. The only thing that exists and is materialized are the outer limits of the moment of exhaustion, of full realization. It is the original reality that remains mute, non-present, but past and to come in a quasi-immediate, but nevertheless mysterious way. What is of central importance is the mystery itself of what is not figured. Simondon's letter entertains a reality that exceeds most discussions concerning technology, information, and technical objects. What is involved is the means by which we try to seize what is hardly perceptible, if arguably there. What exists somehow sensed somewhere between the beginning and the end of a smile and cannot be ignored is the mystery itself. Even though there is nothing in or on the painting that allows us to know this, the smile is unfolding. And it is precisely in the temporal thickness of this unfolding that the potential for such a passion lies. The collapsing of subject and object, of observer and observed, of the outer limits of the smile with the mystery itself, and the assumption of an underlying axiomatic that structures effects allowing them to surface to our attention, to be considered data, all constitute important aspects of Simondon's research on the ontogenesis of phenomena and the individuation and evolution of the living and technical objects. of organisms and of objects and organisms within complex systems. Simondon's exploratory, not to say reticulated line of his research allows him to sidestep the mind-matter dichotomy of Cartesian mechanisms and methods, instead borrowing from fields that conceptually, if not actively, blur this divide. The reflections of biologists, paleoanthropologists, the experiences of experimental and Gestalt psychologists, and the observations of quantum physicists. The body of work these explorations comprise are evidence of a keen desire to understand the workings of things and their functions. They reveal a rich curiosity in the emergent, how it manifests, and what emergence is in relation to matter, to phenomena, to objects, to signification, and finally to its encrypting as an embedded axiomatics of indeterminacy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your very beautiful and super rich presentation. So I think we will hand it over to Stavros so that we can stay within our time limits, but I hope everyone has already kind of a few questions written down that we will address after. So please keep them in mind or put them in the chat. We'll address them after. Take it away, Stavros. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, you see the screen shared, right? Yeah. You can see the screen, yeah.
Yes, we can see the screen.
So I'm going to go straight into it, and if I'm shouting at some points and being a bit more intense, it's just also to keep me a bit awake, because it's like a post-lunch time here in the Netherlands, and it's a bit it's Sunday as well, so it's a bit yeah, it's a bit demanding. Just before I start, a small comment on what Marisabel was now presenting. I'd like just to inform here that since last summer, or summer 20, I think 2020. The information in light of notion of form and individuation, so his PhD thesis of Simondon, has been published in an English translation by Minnesota Press. Taylor Atkins did the translation. It's quite good. So it's more or less we have most of his work now in English, which is a good thing. So why the title, first of all? Why Architects for Simondon? Well, first and foremost, my intention is to be done, even though it sounds a bit pompous. But anyway, my intention is to be done with the Philosophers 4 plague that torments almost any discourse, and especially architecture. And in that sense, I would not like to have philosophy being used metaphorically, or rather misused metaphorically, in any other field than its own. On the contrary, philosophy should be actually, and could actually meet other discourses on the level of the problems that they pose. In that sense, let's not forget what Gilles Deleuze was telling us, that it's actually a question of stealing a word, taking it, we will pick it up, and we will keep it for our own uses, but not as a metaphor. We will proceed neither by metaphor nor by metonym. We will proceed by using an inexact term to say the exact thing. As such, architecture and philosophy can actually meet each other without any metaphors or simplifications, but rather the intensity of a problematic entanglements. On this problematic field, an amateur architectosophy, if I can call it like that, an architectosophy could emerge, one that actually produces architectural concepts for philosophical problems and the other way around. In this architectosophical academy, Simondon would be one of its pioneers because he would be always on the limit. He would be between technology and culture, between actuality and virtuality, between disparation and emergence. He would be a philosopher of humble material done in the workshop production, which, however, succeeded and succeeds in being cosmological. So this is the plan, at least for this brief talk today, to actually steal Simondonian terms, architecturally inexact terms, in order to speak exactly about architecture. However, I will not try to speak about architecture in general, there's no such thing, but rather about the architectural act itself. So through Simondon and through an architectural reconsideration of some of his most critical terms, we can see how we can speak of an architecture that depends only on the architectural act itself and in its capacity to be effectively attuned with a shared informational meaning. So my first question, what is architecture doing? My immediate response would be that architecture produces information. I see some notes in the chat and I don't know if I'm, okay, yeah, it's not about me not being heard. Okay, My immediate response to the question of what architecture is doing is that architecture produces information. Before going and clarifying that production, when it comes to information, is not the most accurate term, because there is another Simondonian one that serves much better, we actually need to, first of all, as Andrej pointed to, and also Marisabel complimented, we need to dissociate information from dataism. Information for Simondon and for architecture, critically, has nothing to do with data, big, small, or anything in between. To confuse information with data is an original sin that we are carrying since the first so-called information theories, be it those of Shannon, of Brillouin, or even Alan Turing himself. Most of those self-proclaimed informational theories deal actually with the transmissibility and compressibility of data, but crucially, not with the effect of data when they get to be eventuating, when they're actually leading to an event. In better terms, they do not deal with data when data get to be informative. Most information theories in that sense are flawed, since they do not examine information, but rather how information can be calculated or even simulated. As such, they are data theories and not information theories. And this is the first important Simondonian lesson we could take, that information is actually a universal process that concerns all being, and it could be understood as the formula for individuation, the sense, the direction according to which a system individuates. Information is actually a requirement for individuation. It's never a given thing, and it can never be measured in bits and bytes, words, or numbers. In simple terms, information, and I'm using Bateson's definition now, information is the difference that can make a difference. It is the potential that can energize a potential. What sort of and how much intensity is needed in order for a transformation to happen? So therefore, information actually becomes synonymous almost with significance, with meaning. Nothing is informational out of birthright, nor anyone gets to be informed in the same way. What matters is neither the emitter nor the message, but rather a particular state of the receiver. And that state needs to be metastable enough, charged with intensity, charged with potentiality, in order to make becoming informed possible. However, we are in for a surprise. Something is actually meaningful when it's constrained. As biologist Stuart Kauffman would say, constraints are information, and information itself is a constraint. And that's the first important lesson that architecture can give back to Simondon. To enhance life, you actually need to constrain it. This is precisely what architecture has been doing. From the first gatherings around a fire painting on the wall of a cave, in a primitive cave, to a lobster dinner, to wink a bit to Kohlhaas now, to a lobster dinner in our Manhattan skyscrapers, architecture actually introduces constraints that reduce our options. So from infinity of options to infinity minus one, at least. And by reducing those options, ironically, actually architecture proliferates our affective capacities, what we can do, our potentials. With architecture, constraints are actually acting for what they are, synapses. A synapse is a singularity, a junction, an almost imperceptible gap through which an impulse of intensity can pass by. And beyond any modal adaptations of placing synapses in space or time, the synaptic moment itself actually folds upon the synaptic location. The two become one, since they're both simply pure action and consequently pure relationality. Both a material object and a figure of thought, the complementarity of an actual brain and a virtual mind. As Félix Guattari would point out, A-signifying synapses are simultaneously irreversibilizing, singularizing, heterogenizing, and necessitating, pushing us from the world of memories of redundancies embedded in explicit coordinates into universes of pure intensive iteration, which have no memory, discursive memory, since the very existence acts as such. And this is the reason, I'm ending the quote now, this is the reason why synapses should be understood as constraints. They actually delimit the field of the actual, and the moment they do so, they reinforce the virtual, they reinforce the potentials. In those passages, in those synaptic passages, architecture turns into something much more significant than simply constructing or designing space. By producing and being produced by synapses that constrain infinity, architecture enunciates, proposes ways of life that would not otherwise have been possible, literally, would never be possible. Who would ever claim that there's something natural or normal or even historically necessary in our Manhattan or Rotterdam or anywhere you might be, lobster dinners? To introduce novel ways of life, architecture not only produces and manipulates those constraints, those synaptic constraints, but crucially determines how, when, and where those synapses can relate with each other. As such, architecture should be understood or could be understood as a transductive meta-synapse, a constraint of constraints of sorts. So when I speak of transduction, and Andrej and Marisabel and Viktoria also attempted to do so, there have been many attempts to explain that term, but that rather obscure in first sight Simondonian term of transduction. Well, it goes without saying that I'm not gonna provide a detailed account of the term, which is both for practical time reasons, but also because I would like to propose a rather simple definition of it. Transduction is actually the operation of moving from the singular to the singular, from a constraint to a constraint, from a synapse to a synapse. And in doing so, by moving from the singular to the singular, you are actually introducing a new constraint that in its own right becomes informative. As a matter of fact, the very term, the very concept of transduction does not belong to Simondon himself. He has simply introduced a wider, broader understanding of the concept that actually was first used in children's psychology, initially from William Stern, later on from Merleau-Ponty, that, as Andrej mentioned, was one of his mentors. When a child is asked why the sun is hot, and that's an example of transductive thinking, so when a child is asked why the sun is hot, it will answer that it is hot because it is on fire. Transduction is a transfer from the particular to the particular, a movement from the singular to the singular without any dominant order intervening. It's a third kind of knowledge, if you may. So in moving from the synapse to another synapse, information emerges as an enabling constraint that energizes a potential. This is why it's not accurate to claim that information is produced. Information is transduced whenever singular synapses are brought together. How is it, however, that the singular can come close to the singular, and how architecture, in the very act of architecting, is actually transductive? The first transductive principle is something that perhaps any architect can actually confirm, despite the stubborn efforts of many reductionists to claim the opposite. Form and function are never to be considered as separate. Simondon would become an ally for us architects here. Against any traditional hylomorphic schema that opposes matter to form, Simondon would claim that any such distinction also implies a binary between structure and operation, or in terms more familiar to architects, between form and function. To position form and function together, Simondon will propose two key terms that both Andrej, Marisabel, and Viktoria mentioned: modulation and alagmatics. Both these terms should essentially be understood as the analytics of transduction, the key processes that explain how information propagates from the encounter of a singular with a singular. As such, they don't stand apart, they're not opposed, they're not a binary. However, by developing a unique account for each one of them, we can actually understand further transduction. Simondon would develop his concept of modulation initially as a theory of structures, or in even more precise terms, he would develop it as an updated theory of genetic structures, since according to him, and that was one of his main complaints and motivations for doing all the things he did, most of our sciences till now have been theories or sciences that focus exclusively on generic structures. So focusing on the process of molding, that Marisabel also touched, which for Simondon, and he's right, it's actually the traditional hylomorphic schema par excellence, where a subject in command dictates matter to assume the form of a brick, and then almost magically out of a black box, a brick indeed pops up. Simondon would make three crucial points. First of all, he would say that the clay is neither passive nor inert, but as any other material, it has its own specific affective properties. Secondly, he would say that the mold is not an ideal, neither an abstract form, but rather a specific material frame that itself has been produced through specific technicities. Finally, the craftsman by increasing the temperature or applying pressure, introduces and manipulates singular intensities that catalyze the resolution of this disparate tension between clay and mold, to the point that the third individual, the brick, can now emerge. This last point, technicity, which brings together the craftsman or the artisan or the architect even to the same plane as the materials and the tools that are used. In other words, by proposing Simondon an account of material production that focuses on what he calls technicity, sheds light to all the tensions, all the struggles that most architects fail to express when they find themselves in the eye of this productive, designerly storm. We stand much closer to the intensity of the architectural act itself if we understand the architect as a helpmate to emergence, Masumi would call it like that, rather than a subject in command. So like architects now, liberated from the tyranny of our supposed pseudo-agency over matter, we can grasp much easier the counterpart of modulation. More than that, we can act, and we should act, effectively to introduce an architectural account of alagmatics. Defined by Simondon as the theory of operations now, alagmatics focus on approaching an operation as the conversion of one structure to the other. In this sense, no operation, no function designed by any architect or any designer can be determined outside of a structure, outside of a form. Any function is always immanent to the form that undergoes it, and vice versa. So what's astonishing regarding alagmatics is that it manages at once to dissociate function from all its functionalist reductionisms, while simultaneously proposing a proper and true account of it. One can no longer speak of function in an essentialist manner. There is no function in general. There are as many functions as the forms that individuate through them, and in doing so, they enunciate, they propose a particular style, a specific how in the it is done. In other words, architectural alagmatics assist in understanding that the singularity of architecture lies in this passage from form to function and vice versa, from structure to operation and vice versa. The capacity of architecture is to catalyze new ways of life by assisting and intensifying the transduction of novel informational constraints. And now to wrap it up, architecture's alagmatics and the modulational individuation of forms that they imply stand very close to the rather obscure Deleuze-Guattarian concept of generalized chromaticism. And Andrej is quite an expert on this, so you can feel free to ask him about it. Deleuze and Guattari described generalized chromaticism as the operation where elements of any nature or any kind are placed together in a continuous variation, and in doing so, new distinctions emerge, but none of them are taken as final, and none of them are prioritized in advance. Simondon's account of individuation put forward the same plea. The knowledge of individuation is the individuation of knowledge, or differently, one cannot know individuation, one can only individuate. As such, Simondon rejects any a priori or a posteriori principle of individuation, and instead demands to examine individuation via individuation itself, on the a presenti of its autonormativity. To explain what autonormativity stands for, Simondon uses the example of a hiker in the forest. Each step that this hiker takes when walking in the woods is its own consequence. It is self-constitutive. The act of walking itself does not include any intrinsic, given in advance directionality, any form of inherent compass that will orient the hiker. Likewise, if the hiker gets lost, it's not possible to depend on any familiar or recognizable exterior norm. In other words, for a hiker in the woods, there are no norms, no set rules of directions. Every step in every direction is equiprobable and equivalent at once. So from an infinity of directions, the first step, the act of hiking in the forest, the act of architecting, becomes the norm itself. Every step that follows it builds on the relation of a step before it, one after the other, leading the hiker to the edge of the forest. This is what Simondon has in mind when he claims that the norm is derived from the act. Every act, anomic from its absolute origin, valorizes itself in an autogenous fashion, because it continues and rests consequently more and more in itself. And I end the quote. In this regard, architectural norms and values, the very logics, practices, and ethics of architecture are not only co-determinable, not only determine one another, they're fundamentally contingent. There is literally no ground for them except from the ground on which the architectural act itself territorializes, the territory that architecture produces. Subsequently, the act itself must allow for this synaptic passage of an architectural memory that will select a territory and will allow it to express and possess a form that is yet to be invented. And that's something that Winter has written quite interestingly on his radical anamnesis text. On the territory and in the architectural act of expression, the technicities that reticularly, reciprocally, make a subject, an object, and an environment fold upon each other become the eventuating appresenting of that which is just about to come. Therefore, the architectural act, as the event, becomes a principle, since it is the moment where the a posteriori becomes a priori. The architect does not perform architecture prior or before the technicities that afford it, but in and during their alagmatic operation. As Simondon would have it, the architect fulfills the function of the present and maintains the reciprocity, the reticularity of its consequences, because her life is made of the rhythms of the technicities that surround her and allow her to connect with them and connect them with one another. Consequently, architectural information, architectural meaning, the meaning that produces architecture and the meaning that architecture is produced of, is actually what allows architecture to further individuate. One step after the other, one architectural act after the other, information transductively propagates the constraints that assist the constant effort of coupling the genetic with the epigenetic via detachable, externalized epiphylogenetic, as Stiegler would say and Andrej informed us about, technicities. In other words, architectural evolution is not something that belongs to the discursive, a succession of different typologies, as any autonomist would say, or ideologies, even worse. Neither is the story of an imposed design with a specific end or a specific beginning. Architectural evolution is the dynamic individuation of a progressive constraint that builds upon itself. What is crucial, and I'm finishing, is that the individuation of this constraint is constantly and continuously open to modulations. The very style of how we architect, how we do architecture, determines not only our current contemporary practices, but is also able to rearrange the entire plane of architecture itself. In the act of architecting, architecture is not only producing its technicities, its norms, and its values. The architectural act crucially allows architecture to rearrange itself without actually erasing itself. It allows for an architectural memory, a memory of the future, to pass through of something that is at once genetic, epigenetic, and epiphylogenetic. Therefore, it is through architecture that we can paraphrase one of Stiegler's favorite dictums, where we get to know that it is not simply the what that makes the who. Actually, the style of eventuating architectural act highlights that first and foremost is the how that makes the what that makes the who. If it was not like that, then why would we bother, and now comes Andres Lobster, why would we bother to climb a skyscraper, built in former indigenous land, just to eat a crustacean that has been just caught from the depths of the Atlantic? Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you so much. That was magnificent. Thank you so much.
For more on this, and also Simondon plus Deleuze, as Andrej mentioned, there is a book of mine coming next June in Routledge. Architectural Technicity, it's the title.
Very excited about that. That's beautiful. So I'm going to attempt to just say a few words about what we just heard. It was a lot, and I think it's magnificent how many overlaps there actually were. I think what's really standing out is that Simondon is not only a philosopher of technology, as he is often illustrated, but much more and much deeply occupied with ontogenesis and relationality and modulation. I think that was very clear in all the presentations, and I think it's beautiful that all three of you showed us the terms transduction and alagmatics. And so I kind of want to unpack that a little bit more. And I wanted to evoke the idea of resonance as well, because I think it's interesting that when you think about resonance in music, and when you think about a string resonating not only with the other strings together, but also kind of inducing another kind of movement in the process. So it's at the same time active and passive. There is kind of in between. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about that in terms of transduction. I mean, transduction is about passing on of structures. And I think it's something that we definitely have to unpack a little bit more. So because it's a process that is kind of in continuous creation of new dimensions, right? So I think it's interesting that it's like an increasing in complexity through transduction. And I think we might want to kind of unpack that a little bit more because it also stands in contrast to deduction and induction as a mode of thinking. So I kind of wanted to, and everyone can pick this up, but I wanted to put it in relationship with knowledge creation or knowledge and ask what, because I think to my understanding, individuation, as Stavros was just saying, cannot be just abstractly understood, but it is in the process of individuation itself. So I think it's really important and very interesting to kind of think about that. So maybe we can unpack what knowledge creation over time would mean for Simondon. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit more. Also in terms of, you know, architectural knowledge being passed on. So maybe, I don't know, Stavros or Andrej or Marisabel, anyone can kind of chime in.
You go, Andrej.
I just wanted to mention, because I think it has been mentioned, but I think it's worthwhile repeating this magical formula of when Simondon says the individuation of knowledge is the knowledge of individuation. That is to say, it's irreversible, and that's what makes it so different from. You mentioned the deduction and induction. I touched on it briefly. We know that the deduction is you put something in the head and you pull it out. I mean, there's nothing ever new that comes out of it. It's purely logical for formalists. When it comes to the induction, it's very often illegitimately it extrapolated beyond, you know, like what we can actually claim. It's charming. But it doesn't always work. It's stretching the resource. There is conceptual resources sometimes too much. Transduction operates immanently in the sense that it's a small. What is it called? It's like a weak induction, no?
Weak abduction.
Weak abduction. You're making small hypotheses. You polarize movements. You make small hypotheses and you falsify them immediately. But it never anything ever falls under N+1 model. That it always operates as it were, step by step. So in order to learn about anything, you have to intervene into the causal fabric in order to see what happens. That's what I think in a way what I meant to say with the reference to Karan Bharat's idea of diffraction. You throw a stone into a pond and then you see what happens if if there is an obstacle. How does it proliferate? How does it move? That to me is what transduction means. It's irreversible. It demands manipulation, and it's not just a critical stance of the megalomania of being in the capacity of observing something from afar or the view from nowhere. It is about tinkering, a moment of relaying in Stengerian terms. You relay in order to kind of arrive at something. And that's in a way, I'm also describing the generalized chromaticism. You have to put things in motion to see where these singularities might be, because they're not there standing for you to pick them up. You have to actually intervene into the causal fabric in order to feel them, to actually tease them out.
But if I may, I mean, to stand close to what I was trying to say before, that not to take the term and apply it metaphorically, let's say in architecture, but let's say, how could we do it the other way around? I think almost anyone in this room that has, because I suppose most of the people are in one way or another into architecture, or have designed something. Even a presentation is a design in its own right. I mean, setting up your slides is a design. Transduction could be that term that can describe this very moment where you don't know exactly where would you like to go, and also you simultaneously know more or less where would you like to go. So you have something that is here and now, and you want to bring something that is not here and not yet to this here and now. And there are various ways to do that. There are ways that, as Andrej was hitting, that you can already do it the same way. I mean, forever. You can keep on doing it the same way. That's not transductive at all. Okay. You can actually do it in an absolutely random way. You can just throw everything you have in one piece of paper and see if it works. That's also not transductive. Transductive is quite close to what would be called by peers, for example, abduction. So it's a form of what Bergson would say could be understood as an intuitive method. Intuitive, not in a diminishing way as intuition, that's something that we should not bother, but intuition as, again, according to Bergson, as truly the most important form of knowledge. The mode of knowledge where you actually start from somewhere and attempt to go to your next step, let's say, but not in an arbitrary manner. It's actually a form of knowledge that you have to continuously, in a stoic way almost, prepare your whole life throughout it in order to be able to actually push through it. I would say that transduction in that sense, more than just the technical, because he goes into various different ways of describing it in different parts of his books, more than the technical part of the transducer, that it's the thing that moves from one spot to the other. It is best understood when he goes and explains it, Simondon, in his book on the technical objects, on the mode of existence, where he clearly connects it with intuition. So I think if you pick it as an intuitive mode of performing, you're quite, where you're doing quite good to actually grasp it.
And you did connect it to the third kind of knowledge that Michael Speaks also spoke of. I want to do speak and spoke in the same sentence. Speaks.
I think that's very important and very interesting. And I was just thinking because Simondon criticizes cybernetics for being too occupied often with closed systems and kind of having the feedback as a priority. And he kind of emphasizes that the direct kind of the involvement and the direct connection to the milieu, so the direct information that comes in is as important as the kind of looped feedback system. So I think that's an interesting connection, and it kind of reminded me of what Marisabel was talking about with the more than, like the gaps that are kind of created in between and the falling out of step that is such a big core part of becoming. And I think it's interesting to kind of see the relationship to technology or technicity. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about the modulation of perception and modulation of the human machine amalgamation. So maybe Marisabel, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you think, or you kind of already told us, but maybe you can unpack a little bit more because it's a lot of content, how it really, like how Simondon sees the kind of mediation and kind of like modulation of perception of human beings, becomings through technology. I think you're muted, unfortunately.
That's a really interesting question. And, you know, it goes back to me, I don't know what Simondon thinks. You know, obviously, I think that is actually, I know what he triggers in terms of the way I think and the way it sort of elicits thought about, well, where are we now? You know, how, because remember, Simondon is writing in the mid-century. He has specific, he has a specific context in which he is actually addressing these issues. And yet, so, you know, what he would think about where we are today in terms of our interface with technology, I have no idea, but it does provide me with some kind of way of entering into the problem. One of the things that I'm very interested in is that essentially that modulation of perception and how we begin to kind of reframe, and Simondon starts to do this, and this is what is very interesting, is that he starts to reframe a conception of human, right? He's not talking about the humanism of, the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. He's reframing what the human really should be or is, and also in respect to the technology. Now, at this point, you know, he's not the only one reflecting. Obviously, we didn't have enough time. This is a period when there's a lot of philosophers reflecting on the status of technology with respect to the human nature, humankind, culture. And so he is not alone. However, it seems that at that time, what is really particular is that he has a very positive sort of view of it. In other words, he is not turning it into a negative or not turning it into a kind of Heideggerian, the lost absolute that this the current technology is actually framing our being in such a way that we are kind of losing ourselves, and that is not what Simondon sees. And so that is the point where I find him extremely interesting at that time. So what does he see? He sees a humanism that is actually not the humanism that we think about normally. It's an engaged and completely sort of embedded in the technicity, in the kind of the technical becoming of the world, which as far as you can see in all of his writings, it goes all the way back. It goes back further than the Enlightenment even. So in this, of course, he's really impacted by André Leroi-Gourhan, who is the paleoanthropologist that is also finding this kind of parallels between the development and the evolution of technology and the evolution of human cognition. So in this sense, for Simondon, that is actually very important research. It's a research that allows him to think that there is no point in actually distancing or separating, that in fact, it's the future of humanity to actually become more and more sort of, I guess you would say, not embedded, but sort of in symbiosis. I'm not even sure I'm using the right term, in transduction with the technology. Now, what would he think of what's happening today? I have no idea. One can only surmise, but it's a very interesting sort of way of entering into the problem. I wanted to say one other thing, which is actually with regard to the transduction and your question earlier about this sort of the idea of kind of like, this goes also back to this question you have about, well, what about systems of knowledge or knowledge making, knowledge creation? And in some senses, that also has to be reframed, right? So the same way that he reframes the notion of hylomorphism, of this idea of this kind of abstraction that forms the material world, there is a different sort of paradigm and a different sort of mechanism that he sees. Mechanism, again, not the right word, but a sort of a different sort of motor to how we create and sort of, I guess you would say, systematize knowledge. And I think that's basically what's behind a lot of what his goal is with the ontogenetic encyclopedia. So that basically, I hope that answers your question. So I find him incredibly positive. I don't know the full extent of what is happening in AI today, and so I think, Neil, you would probably want to talk a little bit more about that and may have thoughts about that. But in my opinion, at this point, based on what I know, he would have been really positive about what the potentials. Right? It's always about potentials with Simondon.
I think I disagree, but it's okay.
Disagree?
What do you want to say? I would like to hear your point.
Yeah.
I don't think he would be positive about it. I also don't think, and but that's, who cares what I think. I would consent that probably he was not having ever any such positive, let's say, conception regarding what we can call humanity. I would even say that for Simondon, but perhaps might be my influence of Stiegler there would be no such thing as humanity. Or if there is such thing as humanity, it's always technologically produced. So there is no such category as the human that exists before technology. What do we mean by technology? We don't mean digital stuff or computers. We mean literally any environmental manipulation. So when you break the branch of a tree and you use it to make noise to ward an animal away, this is fully technological. And by doing so, coincidentally, you actually produce music later on and rhythm. And that leads to culture, and that leads to what we can call human nowadays. So humanity as a category, it's fully contingent and it's fundamentally technological, not the other way around. But again, that might be my Stieglerian input there.
Perhaps we should reframe it as anthropogenesis. Again, transduction, the process, the movement. How is it that a particular style of that we recognize as current state of humanity becomes? Yusuf writes about this anthropogenesis as a process.
But also, it's one of his, sorry. I will.
No, go ahead. No, I think it's interesting because I totally agree that it's an amalgamation. Like it's always been together. It's never been separate. We are partially product of the machines we have created. And it's not like, I think that is kind of, in general, Simondon's goal is to not have this separation. I mean, it's like the binary of matter form. It's the same way that he's trying to avoid that. I think it's the same way that he's trying to avoid kind of separating the human from the technical in that way. And so I totally agree with Stavros on that. And what I was wondering, because I haven't been able to completely fully understand the kind of psychosomatic aspect that Simondon is talking about, of the human and the machine, that he's kind of setting up. And I was wondering, because I am I have come to, to this entire topic of technology more through Mumford and also kind of Bergson, in terms of the temporal aspect of how the perception of the human being is modified through, having created sort of the product of seconds and minutes, is how Mumford calls it. And I don't know if this temporal aspect, so basically that we are like exposing our bodies to that external mechanism that is kind of constraining us in that way, that we're seeing everything not by internal time, but more by the externalized time of minutes and seconds. And I'm not quite sure where Simondon stands within that. I think that's, for me, that was like the kind of powerful moment in Mumford and also in Bergson, to kind of see the temporal or time within that. And I don't know if anyone has an answer, or if I'm wrong in this, but I think the temporal aspect is kind of what I haven't seen really in Simondon.
I think perhaps Marisabel would later say something more about alienation, since she was pointing to that in her presentation. I think that, I mean, what you're asking now is also good for both me and Andrej a bit to clarify this genetic, epigenetic, epiphylogenetic, which is, in other words, again from Stiegler, is the first, second, and third kinds of memory. Okay, and they are connected with time. The first kind of memory is, for example, if somebody kisses you on the cheek, it's the memory, let's say, of your genes themselves. It's a memory of your skin itself. You feel nice about it. Okay. If later on you go and you start going back home and you think about it when you're going back home, it's a second kind of memory. You're kind of making it, you're making it into something that we would call an unspoken culture. You're thinking about it. You're thinking about the feeling of that kiss on the cheek, okay? If you later on go and write a book about it or write a poem about it, which is fully technological, because there's nothing natural about writing something down. I mean, it's a pen, it's a paper, you're changing your environment doing so. You're literally breaking down any temporal boundaries. So you're in a way abolishing time. This can stay here for 1,000 years. And also it can travel from, as we do right now, my words can travel to you or to Andrej, to Marisabel and Neil in the instance of a second. So technology, again, that's why it falls again back to technology. Technology is this third kind of memory. It's epiphylogenetic because it literally leads to a form of individuation, an evolution that doesn't really care about time anymore. It's beyond time. And that's very interesting for architects, I would say, because that's what we're designing. We're literally doing that all the time. We're designing forms of evolution that abolish time itself.
And this is... Go on.
No, I mean, before Andrej, that the problem that Marisabel would be pointing, and Stiegler was very much interested in, is that currently, more and more, as decades pass, we have less and less knowledge. We become more and more alienated and illiterate about these very technological processes that produce both our memories, but also our desires simultaneously. Because the moment you produce a memory, you produce a desire as well. You produce an intention. If you don't know how this is done, if you're alienated from that, then it's much easier for these memories and desires to be homogenized, echo chambers, like Amazon is doing. You know, like this reader reads that book like you and you would like him. So we just get homogenized all together, or even worse, much easier to be controlled. Sorry, Andrej.
No, perfect. I was just going to add something to this idea of how is it, you said that it's transspatial almost, and completely different conception, tertiary memory, it's transgenerational and so on. But I was going to make a contrast with the Bergsonian conception of duration, which can be visualized as a fireworks. Things branch off and off they go, and there's differentiation, progressive differentiation, more and more. When it comes to technology, the funny thing is that as opposed to evolution, natural evolution, this is I qualified it as evolution by means other than life. There is a possibility for some of these branches to come back together. This is in natural evolution never ever happens. So something, a technical object lost and forgotten can come back, be tapped into an assemblage as if no need for it. So that's what makes it epiphylogenetic. So it's a radically different evolutionary line, and I think I've written about it. Clearly I don't have time to go into it now, but I think this is what Deleuze and Guattari also meant by this idea of involution as opposed to simple evolution. Evolution is centrifugal, fireworks, again, duration, proliferation, but involution is also this idea how the inanimate has always been crucial for the animate. The living is utterly dependent on the inorganic, and that's what Delanda means by the inorganic life. Go on, you wanted to.
No, I mean, I think the to go back to the notion of time and the idea of where Simondon's position was at this point, again, I've always been very careful, and perhaps it's something that I should change. I've always been very careful to differentiate between Simondon and those who follow, because I think that sometimes that tends to blur exactly where Simondon was with regard to certain aspects. And with regard to this idea that you have brought up, actually, Stavros, which is this idea of like sort of that rupture, okay, the rupture that he sees that he's trying to, let's put it this way, knit together. The thing that I think it's not, and so I really wanted to make that point very clear, and I hope maybe I didn't, is that he's not looking to reestablish a humanism. He's looking to reestablish a relationship, right? And so what are the terms of this relationship? And that's because it's all about relations for Simondon. What are the terms of the relationship that we must sort of engage with or that we must bring up to engage back into techniques, right? So it's basically, if you're looking at Mumford, he's writing at a point where there's this celebration, the celebration of the parallel progress, the notion of progress of civilization and technology. Simondon's not actually at that point anymore. He's not buying into that story, but he is buying into, to my mind, that there is a need for a different kind of engagement. And that engagement has to do with knowledge. Back to this idea of knowledge creation, has to do with an idea of how you understand techniques as being embedded in your framework of knowing. And so that is a really critical part of the Transductive Act, right? The Transductive Act is about completely sort of becoming the techniques or the technical operation as well. So that's the kind of rapprochement that he's trying to effectuate with this idea of transduction, I think, and that's really the mechanism for bringing the human, whatever that may be, according to him, and techniques. Now, how he would feel about today, I have no way of knowing. So Stavros, you may well be right. But one other thing is, I do think that he actually does touch on time, and on that that engagement with time is very important, even though we didn't really kind of expand on it, I think, in any of our presentations. I hope I kind of brought it forward with that Mona Lisa. He writes this at the very end of his life, really. He dies in 89. He wrote that letter in 82. He's writing it to Jacques Derrida. Now, I have no idea what the subject, whether it was a solicited letter, whether it was part of a long dialogue. What is important, though, is the fact that he's actually engaging this idea of the sort of the felt experience. And I think somebody brought up this notion of that felt experience as being very much a part of this knowledge creation with technicity, and that was a very important, I think, part of that letter for me. This is part of an article where he goes into many other aspects of technological objects, but this one was really striking to me because of the fact that the duration is part of that. And that lived experience is part of that knowledge creation in that moment. And so to me, it's always been, it's one of those incredible passages. In fact, it's the first thing I read when I started my studies. And this is my first article. And I said, this is the guy I'm going to be writing. I'm going to be, researching this. My advisor said, nah, don't do it. And I said, yes, I will. And so here we are. But I think that is, the thing that really struck me at that point was that technology, the subject, and time were completely imbricated in that passage, and that I needed to find out more about that mechanism that he had set in play. The other thing is just a knowledge about what Simondon is doing further in his career after he, his dissertation in the late 50s launches him in some ways. Really about the technical object is really where the focus was, not the individuation, because that was way too dense. At the time, it wasn't even published. It didn't really become published until 2000 in its entirety until 2005. So really, he's known for his work on the technological object. And what is very interesting is that he continues his coursework. He continues to elaborate not just on the history of technics, but he continues to elaborate at the same time, developing courses on perception and on also invention and intuition. So what you were bringing up, Victoria, which is very correct, is that in a certain sense, this is a new kind of intuition, is a form of knowing, is actually the kind of framework that he envisions as being the way to move away from that hylomorphic schema in a way. But he's trying to systematize it. He's trying to find an axiom, a series of axioms that he can link together that can loosely allow this to develop without, again, creating that problem, the hylomorphic problem, which is the system framing, again, dampening on the actual material reality. So sorry to get on my soapbox, but that's sort of what's that.
Oh, thank you. I think, yeah, go ahead, Andrej. Sorry.
Because I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and I think it also was just Marisabel shared with us. We can, from our own experience, try to write a grant proposal on technicity, and you'll be flatly rejected. It's impossible. But I think it also has to do with a certain kind of attitude. I think what this demands is, he clearly makes no distinction between subject and object, which is already puzzling in itself. Relation comes first, and so on. So which means that from now on, we have to think in terms of, how to establish transdisciplinary networks, because he just goes wherever it takes for his philosophy to be developed. And this is something that is not very welcome. And today, we have this problem that in spite of all the sophistication, we suffer from convergence that Stavros was hinting at when he says you buy a book and then you recommended books like people like, if you want to be like you, be more like you, buy these books and so on. Neighborhoods, Wendy Chun writes about this homophily, the idea that everything becomes the same, and artificial intelligence, instead of kind of providing for divergence of things, it converges on a point. Recently, I saw a beautiful presentation by this science fiction writer, Sterling, who says artificial intelligence today can be could be qualified as automatized statistics. It's not really fulfilling its promise of generalized chromaticism, of bringing something that could have not been thought of. And that's why I was insisting on this bizarre image of this naked guy on the 9th floor, because these things, you cannot ever invent them. They just come out of this a kind of open attitude that takes really open system for what they are, and counts on encounters that cannot be predicted. I'm belaboring the point, but you see what I mean. It seems to me that I'm trying to address some of the questions in the chat, because people say, so what does that mean? What are we doing? What is an architect to do?
Can I just first of all thank you for this incredible discussion? It's really illuminating, and I on one hand I got a sense of actually a missing piece in the jigsaw. I think that's been overlooked. I mean, connecting Stiegler with other things, also establishing some kind of ground out of which some of the Deleuze's work is coming, and so on. It's actually really interesting from that point of view. But so it's kind of making these connections. But I think there's a little bit danger in that sense in some of these, because I think the danger is that I want to go back to some of the discussion we had about Foucault, about how people misread the panopticon as though it was talking about a building. It was actually a diagram for the way that society operates, and and I think that's always the case when you come across some of these philosophical concepts. I mean, Zimmel's The Bridge and the Door is also, he's not literally talking about a bridge and a door. And I'm just wondering to what extent and I haven't read the Simondon, so I don't know, but when the discussion of the mold was going on, whether he's really talking about the mold as mold, or whether it becomes almost like a metaphor to try and engage with other things. And I'm at this point, in terms of the kind of discourse of artificial intelligence, I think it's more, it's almost like he uses technology as almost like a way to think about things, and it's not about the object itself as so much as something else. And from that point of view, I think that artificial intelligence has that potential, because it's on its own. It's never on its own as an object. It's always a question of extended intelligence, how it relates to the human. So I'm just wondering, to some extent, because I think what is happening now is something very interesting in terms of of generating knowledge itself, and just in this discussion, laying down some foundations for further discussions. I'm just wondering whether we can't, is he really talking about a kind of architecture, objects and so on, or is he more talking about something that becomes a kind of, you almost think through this technology, you think through the objects, and I'm wondering what this discussion over the internet constitutes. Is that not really what he's talking about in terms of architecture, or is he talking about the literal architectural form itself? These are just kind of questions that pop out of the discussion.
When it comes to the mold in modulation, he speaks literally about it. He's not metaphorical. It's some of the most boring pages in his books are the pages where he goes for 20 long pages non-stop, speaking about a very specific, let's say, example for, I don't know, from something technological, let's call it like that, in order to come to some conclusions that not apply, but also work together in another field. Actually, in the individuation in light of notions of form and information, very long title, he has quite some passages that he tries to explain that if I am to, as a method, so this way of doing stuff or doing philosophy as actually a method, which is what he coins in a way also as transductive. In that sense, one of the easiest examples that I could give, let's say, is that Goethe, when Goethe was going, it was Goethe that he was the avid, let's say, amateur botanologist, right? That he could actually go and see how things in nature are developing without having studied it himself. So he had developed an intuitive, let's say, an intuitive mode of approaching the development of plants. And one could claim that this sensitivity he had, it was a sensitivity he had cultivated through being involved in other forms of individuations that he was studying, okay? Many other forms. So what Simondon is doing in a way or proposing is that if you get to be sensitive to this individuating line where a mold, a clay, the craftsman come together and produce something, you actually, that's why he says that the knowledge of individuation is the individuation of knowledge, you actually become sensitive into being intuitive to other forms of individuation as well. So the more you open up these sensitivities, the more you're capable of doing this transductive method, let's say, which is literally, he calls it in another book, a leap of faith. It's literally a leap of faith. There's no guarantee that it's going to work. Becoming sensitive in how plants develop, or becoming sensitive in I don't know what, could perhaps make you a better architect, or I don't know how to call it, because you could be sensitive to a line of individuation that is not here yet. You're simply intuiting it. So he's taking the literal in order not to speak metaphorical about anything, but in order to increase his sensitivities as literally a method now, though.
And if there is any analogy, it's always analogy of relation, not of an image of a thing.
Yes.
Well, but let me just say, okay, so that's what we think he's doing. We think he's literally referring to the mold, but is he? I think Marisabel said
he's using the mold. I'm sorry, Neil. He's using the mold, and just the same way that he's using the mold, he's using the crystal, the formation of the crystal, as actually a paradigm for kind of a different processes of emergence. And so, to answer your question, I think that he goes. It's not just, he does look at architecture, and he seems to have a fascination with Le Corbusier, but I think, he does look at architecture, he does look at many different things. He's actually almost like a naturalist, if you will, collecting and looking both at the natural world, at the physical world, and also researching. And so I think what he's actually really interested in, and I think really what's driving this is he really wants to understand emergence. He really wants to actually be able to understand by some sort of principle that he can understand how it works. Because hylomorphism doesn't work, and neither does the crystal, by the way. The crystal can only work for an inanimate thing, but not really for a living system. And so that, I think, is really so you're absolutely right. I think he's looking at all of these things as a way of understanding something a little bit deeper that is really not, kind of specifically, well, he does mention it, right? Individuation is all about that. But so I think that those two things, the paradigms, and yes, that clay gets molded so many times in so many books. By the end of it, you have a wall of bricks. But the thing is, it's really serving as a way of illustrating something he's trying to express that words cannot do for him. And that's to go back to what you're saying, Andrej, try to do a grand proposal on transduction, it'll be dumped into the wastebasket. How do you explain it?
It has been.
What?
It has been quite some time, yes.
Good to know.
First-hand experience, yes. But we did teach it, as I mentioned, the pilot project, and mind you, not to a master students. It's our first experience with bachelor students, and they got it. I mean, this is interesting. It was interesting for them sufficiently. We also got the anonymous grading, and it went really well. And I think so. It can be taught. It just can't be sold as a project. I think to official bodies.
Yes.
Could I just add that something? I think I always kind of worry what it is, how our way of thinking as architects. I mean, I think I use this term architecturalization, and I think that needs to be interrogated further about how we think as architects, as opposed to how a philosopher would think. And I think there's a danger that even though a philosopher's talking about architecture, I mean, let's say someone like Frederick Jameson, I'm not quite sure I'd call him a philosopher, but when he's talking about the Bonaventure Hotel, he's not talking about it as an architect. And there's a different sensibility, different engagement that happens from there. But the question I really want to ask is whether we can kind of somehow theorize what's happening now, right now, in this situation, in terms of the internet, in terms of the kind of synapses, the informational flows, through the logic of Simondon, and whether it might begin to be able to articulate this curious emergent phenomena we're discovering about these kind of connections that are happening on the internet in these kind of moments. Any thoughts?
Victoria, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
I think it's a really interesting way that Neil is posing this here. I think I have to think about that a little bit, because I think we are at a very interesting moment in time, and I think for myself to kind of imbue my actions with what I'm thinking is sometimes extremely difficult, especially because we kind of find ourselves in a time where there's, on one hand, in many ways, passive consumption, and on the other hand, like a technocratic enthusiasm that is kind of, how do you find a mode in between? How do you find a way of practicing and thinking that is imbued and kind of cross-pollinates each other? And I think it's sometimes not extremely helpful to just kind of apply directly. I think if Simondon is teaching us one thing, it is about the relationality and the spaces that are opening up between, and the kind of residue and irresolution that's happening. And so applying one-to-one things that you think to how you act is sometimes actually kind of dangerous, especially if you are interested in philosophy and theory. But I think they can inform each other, like really in the Simondonian way of where certain things, I think the biggest takeaway for me, myself, from what we've seen so far, listened to so far, is really that the direct engagement and the kind of getting involved, and the kind of transductive way of being in the world, which is really sometimes not applying one thing to the other, but really getting started and kind of finding that moment that you get involved. And that can be in many different ways, but I think it's beautiful because not one mode is the same like the other, but I think getting involved is kind of the beginning of it. And that might be very vague, but I think it's also interesting that the word of 2021, I think I heard that yesterday, is allyship. And I think allyship in a sense is interesting because it's kind of saying that things are distinct, but they're connected. and that I am an ally to someone else means that I'm not the other person, but I'm connected. And I think it is in that connection and in that kind of movement back and forth. I think the image that I find one of the most beautiful in Simondon is desperation. So the two images that are in themselves different, because when I see with my eyes, I think that's his to the topic that he has very different interests. He's talking about vision and how two different images that I see with my two different eyes in my brain actually become a temporary resolution of what I'm seeing, what I'm involved. And I can't just stop seeing, so I'm always involved. And I think the involvement and the becoming involved is extremely important, especially for young people right now in this time. And also not trying to come up with an abstract concept that's going to guide, but really actually getting involved and starting and having that starting point. Yeah, I think it's very, very abstract, but that's kind of what's in my head right now.
And he's very clear that this has nothing to do with dialectics and negation. I mean, so it's not that the one eye negates the other and they kind of don't speak to each other anymore. So it's totally against the Hegelian forms of thinking that actually are about negation, negative forms of thinking. It's about emergence, as Marisabel was saying. It's about new things being produced.
I think one term that we haven't used a lot, I'm sorry, Andrej.
No, please.
One term that we haven't really discussed a lot is this idea of Simondon, where he refers to reticulation, which is a really important concept for Simondon. And it's, I mean, loosely you could call it a network. We talk about networks all the time, but I think that for Simondon it's a very different, he uses the term network and actually, no, sorry, he uses the term reticulation and actually says he does not want to use the term network. I forget, I think in his interview with the mechanologist, is because there is something to this notion of, as you were saying, allyship or connection that for him is the essential substrate of what we have. Okay, so that is basically the way to kind of structure the world. And it's, again, back to yes, it's not dialectical thinking at all. It's actually much more of an expansive thinking. There is no limit, in a way, in this kind of way of thinking, as well as, you know, there is this kind of the idea in Simondon that he picks up on and talks about and actually, you know, expands, is this the importance of analogy as a logical structure, not just, you know, so that the analogical, and that being the analogy of relation, not of resemblance, not of like and like, but really of how things function and how they find this resonance that you had asked about earlier, is really what actually creates that glue between things. And so, or attractor, or whatever the word might be. And so I think it's a very interesting time right now for us, because we're kind of let loose on this expanse called the internet at this point, and there are connections being made, multiple connections in every direction. It's reticulating at an infinitesimally large, I mean, it's huge, an infinitely large speeds, excuse me. And to me, it just seems to me, it feels very much, in some respects, what we're doing now, it really feels like some of the things that he was already beginning to theorize in the late 50s, which is what's really remarkable, is that he was already seeing this kind of notion of the reticulated structure that emerges from the expanse, and that can be provisional and then reform as the conditions of existence manifest that allow that to happen. And so it's in some ways, I think that he would see this and recognize it immediately. There'd be a sense of recognition, right? But again, I don't know what he thinks.
No, I guess that's exactly what I was thinking, Marisabel. I mean, alongside all this, there's another kind of trajectory, which is kind of like through kind of Deleuze, Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari, the erosion of the hegemony of the physical, as I've called it, where the physical structure gives way to other forms of control system, like credit and so on. But I'm just wondering, since the word architecture is used in the world of computer science, whether we can just kind of rethink beyond the simple logic of the physical mold to this relationality through less material means, but nonetheless having something that is structured a little like architecture. I guess that's not very clear, but that's what I'm thinking about. So,
But I think, Neil, in that sense, when Simondon proposes this associated milieu, I mean, this is action perceptions, something that is both pretension and retention, something that is extends beyond the extensive. It's really intensive, and I think I just want to share an anecdote. Might answer some of the questions. It has to do with inspiration as well. I sometimes sit in committees as a delegate, and I was exposed to this defense master project from the building technology people, so not necessarily that branch of architecture. And I was really blown away with the level of sophistication, what they can do now. They populate the field. There's a particular assignment. They have to resolve the problem between something that has to be both structurally sound and also have the adequate thermal insulation. So that now they can calculate it perfectly, so that the resolution is something that takes into account these disparate notions, and then voila, you get something that is both porous and it works in every way. And me as an outsider, I put a simple question to them: how do you decide? And they tell me this is, I mean, it's easy for us now. We've got the means, the technology. It's a matter of optimization. I'm thinking, but what does make it into that? How do you dramatize your field so as to come up with that kind of resolution, that kind of optimization? And then, of course, just as a matter of provocation, I asked them, but have you also considered some level of redundancy? Because there's probably something that you could have not predicted at this point. You take into account certain things and then it's resolved. And they are not, I mean, they simply look at me as if they have no idea what I'm talking about. And I think this is incredibly dangerous, because now, I mean, Simondon would be on the one hand thrilled with the capacity of the what we can do, how we can be supported in trying to find the resolution of problems. But at the same time, I think he would be probably disappointed by how narrow we populate the field of possibilities. And I think that your question on how to extend beyond something that is incorporeal yet real, and I think this is what we mean by associated fields, and then this the idea of the annexed milieu is exactly trying to continue working that way.
And his way of approaching the associated milieu, Simondon, is also, and I know Victoria perhaps might need to make us control the time, because I don't know how we're doing, but his way of approaching the associated milieu is also, in a way, his theory of time simultaneously. And it's also, again, triple simultaneously, is a theory that surprisingly is about membranes and foldings. So he's one of the very few figures that manages to break another binary between space and time by introducing the concept of a membrane, and in a way that I would say it's 10 times at least more interesting than what Deleuze, for example, might have written about folds and about membranes, and also much more interesting, particularly for architects, to work with it. Because basically he's saying that the interior and the exterior are both connected with becoming. An interior is something that it's becoming slowly. So even the organs of your body adjust with you since you were born, and they're slowly changing through time. And an exterior is an unexpected encounter. It's something that you're not yet aware of, and it can come and take you by surprise at any moment. And in this relation of interior and exterior is always mediated, it's not a proper word, it's always manipulated technologically. You can open the opportunities for more encounters with an unexpected futurity, or you can ward them off. I suppose what Andrej was saying is that no matter how much advanced you might be supposedly practically, technologically, you might be actually doing steps that work in the opposite direction, that make the interior and the exterior not meet with each other, but rather the interior become even more interiorized. What Deleuze and Guattari were calling as a microfascism. You care only about yourself, and more about yourself, and more about yourself, and more about yourself. And I think it's a very interesting concept, the way that he proposes to approach time, but actually, particularly for architects, is very, I wouldn't say easy, but we are already somehow sensitive to how we could work with it.
I did try to make the distinction between the physical vital and psychosocial individuation, how different they are, vis-a-vis this idea of exosomatization, something put out transgenerational, the state sedimented memory, as in the city or architecture. So.
Thank you so much. I was just reminded, I mean, we have a bit of time. I wanted to actually have one more question from the audience, because Matt Gorbett was asking a question. I want to bring him in. I just wanted to make one real brief comment, because I remember in some interview with Taylor Atkins, he was actually talking about the translation and how much trouble he had with the translation or direct translation of milieu, because milieu in French, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what he's saying is that milieu also means middle. and therefore it's set up even in that as more indifferent than just talking about environment. I think it's interesting that even within the words, and sometimes, of course, things get lost within the translation, but I think it's also like the words that Simondon uses that kind of set up and kind of support the system that he's trying to set up. But with that, I want to ask Matt to maybe turn on his camera and ask his question.
Sure, thanks. It's just amazing being a fly on the wall on this particular conversation. The whole series is amazing, but this one for me has just been mind-blowing. So thank you so much, and thank you to all the guests. Specifically, what you were just saying about milieu and the middle and this mediation, and it's really resonating with me, this Simondon, that we're talking about spaces in between. And my question was just really about it twigged the thing that Aaron Manning was talking about immediation, and about this idea of the immediate, but also this idea of working not as mediator between two poles, but working across and always just being in that moment. And I just noticed that Andrej referenced this, and I wondered if he could take it just a little bit further, and also specifically to that, if there is a connection. If that presupposes some connection to other cultures outside of the sort of Western tradition, and if Simondon had any sort of intersection with that. And that's, I guess, a question to all of the panelists. So thank you.
Oh, beautiful. I'm very glad that you asked this question. And I just say, before you, when your image appeared, I also noticed it's Aarhus, isn't it? Eliasson, you're standing in the.
Oh yes, yeah. It is. It's a lovely. That was an amazing space. Yeah. At Aarhus, yes.
Wonderful. It brings back some beautiful memories from the place. I attended an affect theory workshop there just before the corona. No, you're spot on. It's exactly right. I think Manning Erin has actually given us. She reinvigorated transduction by this neologism, immediation, and I think she published together exactly with people from Aarhus, whose name now escaped me, with their crew. They published 2 books on immediation, 2 books, and they're open source. I think open. What is it called?
Access. Yeah, I can put a link if you want. Yeah.
Please put 2 books, open source. You can download them, and there is a very long, beautiful interview on the concept of immediation. And I think you would recognize very soon that she even explicitly refers to Simondon, but I think it's exactly about that. And I think that's what makes it. That's what I meant by saying that this is not a matter of communication. It's not about, with Simondon, there is no distinction between subject and object. Subject and object are, it's the primacy of relation, the exteriority of relations, that the relation comes first and then has the capacity to actually engender the subject and the object, as it were. So it's, and it's very difficult to convince people, but I think it's also to do with why is it that we should not talk about networks, because networks, this is Delanda's point, networks connect dots, but dots pre-exist as much as subjects pre-exist their relations. If you talk about, maybe perhaps meshwork is another way of putting it, when Deleuze and Guattari say we are sick of dots, we like lines, lines, they do produce dots, but they produce it at the point of intersection where 2 lines come together. Even William James also talks about this. How is it that 2 things can be both thoughts and things? Of course they do, because they belong to lines, and these lines, they come together, they intersect at that point. They have something in common, namely the line. But I think I like the way that you connect it also to the problem of decolonization, and the fact that this theory, because it's not n+1, it does not subsume everything. It doesn't start from presupposition of a totality that then we have to make sense of. If it operates at this crest of immediation, what Stavros described as the very boundary, because this boundary moves all the time. If something that is interior is also a matter of past, and something that is exterior is a matter of encounter, which means that you cannot not but be open, disposed for genuine encounter, not necessarily always striving to subsume things that you recognize under the categories that you already know, but it actually, that's the line, that individuation of knowledge is the knowledge of individuation, and of course it means that you cannot stop reading, thinking, and writing. It's a lifelong project, and I think increasingly more we realize that we have been perhaps too quick to conclude that there is a way to to contain all the possibilities. But I think that will be my modest kind of way to respond to your
Thank
question.
If I know, I'd love to hear a little bit more from others on this, but I just there's two things you said there that maybe this is even more to throw into the conversation. I'm not sure, but you talked about points and lines and networks, and as soon as you said that, I started thinking about the sort of what's it called? These force solving AIs or algorithms that remove, by doing extraction, they start with a solid and there are no points, but at the end of the day, you still have lines that connect points. You end up extracting programs like Amoeba or whatnot, where they're sort of, doing this. And from an architectural point of view, that's very interesting because you're no longer starting with those points and working with the forces. And maybe that's related in some way. So I just,
it's inevitable. Sooner or later, I did mention affordance theory, which is very close to my heart. And I think when Gibson coins the neologism affordance, I think this is exactly what he's doing. And he says, you're not designing a chair, you're designing sit-on-ability, which of course means that there is a short people, little people, kids, pregnant ladies. I mean, so you cannot but start from the relationality itself, and eventually there will be a chair that we call and recognize and pigeonhole as a category chair. But I think just to force students to think in terms of what does it mean to think relations first is to think by way of affordances rather than things and objects.
It's to think by way of affordances and also to enhance again a certain sensitivity, which in other words, if you're orthodox Simondonian, it would be to enhance a certain level of metastability of the one, let's say, that is in the process of, for example, to design a chair. I mean, that's the crucial point when it comes to Simondon and his understanding of information. Marisabel pointed to that, opposite to cyberneticians of the time, he was very clear about it, that information is neither of the message, neither of the emitter, is always of the receiver. So if you have a cat and I tell you the cat is dead, then you're devastated. But if you have no cat, neither you know anyone that has a cat, the phrase the cat is dead is just a phrase for you. I mean, you don't really give a shit about it, you don't really care about it. So it's about your own sensitivity, in that sense, your own metastability of being sensitive to a germ, to something that comes from the outside and can cause you to further change, to further individuate, to transform, to be devastated or to feel happy. So the point for an architect, and that's the pedagogical aspect that Andrej was mentioning, how could you teach architects not just stuff them with typologies all the time, neither just make them feel amazed by technological developments? How could you teach them to be sensitive even about things that they're not really already themselves have experienced? But they are not going through dead cats in order to be sensitive about pets, That's what I'm trying to say. They have not really died or given birth in order to be sensitive about a bedroom, which is actually not just a square space that we put a bed. It's actually a space where people get born, a space where people die, a space where people do everything in between. How can we increase that sensitivity? At least that's the lesson I take from Simondon as an architect now.
And if this is, Andrew was kind enough to mention this, we tackled some of these issues, just published a month ago. So Andrew Ballantyne mentioned it, no? He was one of the contributors.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I think we actually kind of have to wrap it up, but I wanted to give the opportunity to maybe say closing words if anybody wants to say something. I think we have been all extremely enriched today with all these ideas, and I hope they simmer and individuate in us now from today on and become new interesting ideas. So yeah, if anybody has any closing words, I was really happy for today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for me.
My previous comment is the final comment from me. I would just, and that's a provocation to Neil, I would just propose that if the series on architecture plus philosophy happens again, I don't know, there is another figure at the same time, which is Raymond Rouyer, which reads very well together with Simondon and makes you understand even more what Deleuze, Guattari, and others, post-structuralists, were writing about. My recommendation.
Another obscure figure. I just want to say that I really, I'm a fan of Digital Futures. I've seen roughly 60% of all the videos, which I think is quite a lot because you've been so productive. And I think it's a wonderful source, and I congratulate you. My head off to you all, the whole crew. Wonderful, wonderful stuff.
Can I just respond? Thank you, Andrej. Thank you, Stavro. I mean, I think what the question about relationality is an incredibly interesting one. I think if there's anything that's kind of blocked off that relationality, it's been the kind of problem of understanding what Simondon was talking about in French, right? And I think somehow what we're doing with this kind of this operation, what you call it, reticulation or whatever, is actually it's about this kind of relationality, you know. And I think we're actually living Simondon in a kind of strange way, which is I think all sorts of possibilities afforded by this. And just to kind of answer your question, Andrej, this is just part of a continuum in some ways. I mean, I certainly hope that we can continue this because it seems to be incredibly productive. From a personal perspective, I never did know anything about Simondon really before today. Now I'm full of ideas and thoughts and provocations and so on. And I think this is what we have a responsibility to do. Is kind of to provoke people and to stimulate this debate. And what I think is so reassuring about this particular series is that you could have taken the view that actually philosophy had its moment in architecture and it's gone, but actually what we're seeing is something that is very much alive and well, that has been fed not just by these young talents emerging, I'm handing over, I feel like, kind of baton to an amazing new generation, but also just by the kind of discourses that are enabled by this platform. And I think it'd be interesting to theorize it from a kind of Simondonian sort of way of thinking what is actually happening, because it's a new phenomenon. We really haven't thought about it, and it is absolutely about relationality and synapses and God knows what else. So just to say, we are planning the sort of the summer at the moment, as it were, some kind of event. I would love to have a workshop in the summer that would involve a kind of theory workshop that involved the group here to begin with, first of all, but also, we will continue this next semester. And I know that Marisabel is working with Lars on a series that she maybe want to mention. I will be doing something next semester on a kind of theory of intelligence, shall we say, something like that. I would love to try and think how we can just kind of allow these things to proliferate. I don't want to use the word rhizome because it's not a Simondon word, but I think there is something interesting about amazing about what this phenomenon and what is emerging right now. So this has been an incredible session. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Viktoria, especially for chairing this whole thing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And Marisabel, we cut you off earlier. I wanted you to have the last word.
I had one word. Thank you. Or 2 words, excuse me. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure throughout the semester, actually, and throughout the summer, since I actually plugged in over the summer. And that's when I first met many of the people here. And it's just been wonderful. For me, I have to say, working with the Simondon material, I have been doing this for quite a while, probably longer than I should have. But it's, to have a community to be able to speak with has made this incredibly, incredibly valuable to me, because it's one thing to be able to immerse yourself in something, but also to engage in this conversation has no measure, really. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this, Neil, and giving us the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that it's now a special delegation. We're just in this process right now this week when we're kind of allowing the Arabic language and a Farsi session and hopefully a Spanish session to take. I think that it's really. It's over to you guys, right? I mean, thank you for taking up the challenge, and thank you for contributing. Digital Futures would be nothing without this incredible contribution. So I've really enjoyed today. It's been a fabulous session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
and
Victoria.
Especially, thank you to the team as well that has been behind this. So thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. There is a whole team working behind this to make this happen. So, and they're not, you can't see them like in an iceberg, but they're there. Thank you so much, everyone who's been contributing to this. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 And happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
You too. Happy break.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.